Well, welcome to our new series, everyone, called Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization, an overview of A. Leo Oppenheim's book. In this series, we're going to be talking about Mesopotamia. So this week, we're going to start with Mesopotamia, Assyriology. What is this stuff? We're going to look at the literary stream of tradition, texts about day-to-day activities, and finally, royal inscriptions. Essentially, today we're going to talk about what Mesopotamia is, what Assyriology is, and the basics of cuneiform culture, what cuneiform texts existed in Mesopotamia, and how do they break down by general category. I promise it will be exciting. So what in the world is Mesopotamia? What is Assyriology? The purpose of this book is to introduce you to this dead civilization. And so he begins by answering these basic questions. Mesopotamia is Greek for the land between the rivers, which refers to the land that exists between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, modern Iraq and Syria, parts of Syria anyway, eastern Syria. The writing that was known from this region in antiquity was called cuneiform, wedge-shaped writing, and it was impressed on clay with a reed stylus. And we have a number of videos, introductory videos that you can look at that Megan has put together to talk about cuneiform writing, what tablets look like, and so I won't go back over those things here. You can find them on Digital Hammurabi on the YouTube channel. Oh, Megan says linked in the description. See, this is why she's good at this stuff. Early in cuneiform research, in the 19th century when people were beginning to decipher cuneiform and understand it, the language was known as Assyrian. Later, it was determined that there was an Assyrian and a Babylonian dialect of Akkadian. The language is called Akkadian. However, Assyrian stuck, and it became the basis for the name of the discipline, Assyriology. So it's the study of the Assyrian language, but more broadly today, Assyriology focuses on the languages and the culture of ancient Mesopotamia, which is primarily Sumerian and Akkadian. So cuneiform was used. It's a syllabic script. It was primarily a syllabic script. Later it became used to write alphabetic scripts. But it's been used to write many languages, including Akkadian, Sumerian, Hittite, Old Persian, Ugaritic, etc. Assyriology proper, though, focuses primarily on Akkadian and Sumerian, the languages of ancient Mesopotamia. So cuneiform, this wedge-shaped writing, is found in Mesopotamia on many materials, many media, but two significant media are monuments and clay tablets. So when you think about ancient Mesopotamia, you think about cuneiform, oftentimes you think about these very impressive monuments, these statues, these reliefs that have cuneiform on them. In reality, though, much more important are the clay tablets, and we're going to talk about primarily those today. So Oppenheim divides these texts, the texts that are found on the clay tablets, into two primary categories. He calls them the stream of tradition and the day-to-day activities. So let's talk about them. The stream of tradition basically encompasses the literary texts. Now, it's a very broad term, and so we'll get into more of the specifics. It is the realm of the scribes. So the scribes are the ones that transmitted this information, and interestingly enough, they were copied as part of their scribal training. And we see this in particular during the Old Babylonian period, so the early part of the second millennium. And it was used as part of their scribal training to teach them the Sumerian and Akkadian languages, and also, we know, to indoctrinate them. We can talk about that later. Now, a significant source of, albeit later, Cuneiform culture, evidence of cuneiform language in Akkadian and Sumerian is Ashurbanipal's library from the 7th century. I put this library in quotation marks, but this is a collection of texts that Ashurbanipal the king gathered from all over Mesopotamia. And it included such texts as omens. Omens are single-line entries, often about an act or an event or a physical feature of an animal, a human, astral bodies, etc. And these entries, these omens, contain a predictive formula, and it allowed the gods to speak to humanity through the omen itself, and we'll get into them later in some more detail. Lexical lists are these long lists, often in columns, vertical columns, that contain lists of signs, vocabulary. You even see things like lists of different grammatical forms. There are lots of things that lexical lists can contain, and they're integral to Mesopotamian culture. Incantations and prayers. We see epic literature, which of course is the most common, the thing that's most widely known, I think, about Mesopotamian literature. We also have fables, and for some reason I've put prayers there again. Proverbs is what I meant there. Sorry. I typed prayers. If you've been watching the textual criticism, this is my eye skipping and duplicating. So this is a form of dictography. I'm writing something twice. I meant to write Proverbs. Sorry. And finally, catalogs. So catalogs were used to take inventory of what was there, perhaps on the shelf or in the collection. These are the different parts of the stream of tradition. Now, there was some standardization. You might hear the word canonization, often put in quotation marks. This standardization showed as time went by, people, when they copied these, when scribes copied these texts, they copied them in a standardized form. Now, some of these texts became standardized very early. For example, lexical lists began to standardize much earlier. Some texts became more standardized later. So, for example, the laments. Laments had some standardized forms early in the second millennium, but became much more standardized in the first millennium. So, now we've looked at the texts that were in the realm of the scribes. Now we turn to the texts that were part of day-to-day activities that still involved the scribes in some cases, but also could involve, more common people. So, for example, we have records of administrative transactions. So we have sales receipts, we have rentals, loans, marriage contracts, wills, etc. We have all of these documents, these genres. These types of documents are very common in the ancient Near East, in Mesopotamia. But we also have letters, and letters between many different individuals. For example, regular people could write letters to one another. We see this, for example, in the old Assyrian period, merchants writing to one another. We can see high-ranking officials writing. We see kings writing to one another. For example, during the Amarna period, kings writing back and forth letters to one another. And we even see kings writing to deities. So one could write to a deity. So all kinds of letters existed in ancient Mesopotamia. One final genre of text that we need to look at are the royal inscriptions. Now, these were not meant to convey information to the general public. As a matter of fact, they were usually buried in the foundation, either of a temple or a palace. These were communications between the king and the god very often. If you'd like more information, you can see Megan's daily data linked in the description, on royal inscriptions. It's an excellent video. Okay, that's a good basic introduction to what Mesopotamia was in very broad strokes and what Assyriology consists of. What is it the study of? It's a study of ancient Mesopotamia, its languages and culture, and the basic breakdown of the different genres, very generally, of cuneiform texts that were written in Akkadian and Sumerian. Coming up, we're going to begin to look at an introduction more specifically to ancient Mesopotamia. We're going to look at the land, the surrounding regions, all the interesting basic information pertaining to Mesopotamia. So, until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back, everyone, to our overview of ancient Mesopotamia, a survey of the book, The Portrait of a Dead Civilization. This is part 2. We're looking at the setting of ancient Mesopotamia. So we're going to first take a look at the general features of the land. Then we're going to look at the differences between northern and southern Mesopotamia. And then finally, the very important and distinct rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates. So what were some of the general features of the land? Well, Mesopotamia was part of that area known as the Fertile Crescent. It was boxed in by the Zagros Mountains on the east, the hills and plateaus to the north and the west led toward the Taurus Mountains. To the west directly, you had Lebanon, and beyond it, the Mediterranean. And to the south, you had the Persian Gulf. There was a great deal of trade that went on along the Persian Gulf, down to the south and off to the east through the Zagros Mountains into the Indus Valley. And of course, later trade would go from northern Mesopotamia over to the west, up into Anatolia, and ultimately throughout the ancient Near East as a whole. But I digress. Now, what were the differences between northern and southern Mesopotamia? Well, northern Mesopotamia tended to be a larger, broader, less bounded area. We consider the north of Mesopotamia the place that is above where the Tigris and the Euphrates come close together. And this area is characterized throughout history by expansion and contraction of the powers that exist in the area, particularly Assyria. One of the characteristic features of northern Mesopotamia is that it's above the 200 millimeter ISO height, which means that you are able to practice rainfall farming in northern Mesopotamia. So you had larger areas of farming, cultivation. They didn't produce quite as much as what would be produced in the south, but it was able to be done naturally by rainfall. In southern Mesopotamia, however, which we consider south of that area where the Tigris and Euphrates approach one another, it was a smaller area and it was crisscrossed by various canals. This was a more densely populated area. Rainfall farming was not possible here. It's below that 200 millimeter ISO height. And so irrigation farming was used instead. And this led ultimately, to some degree, to the more dense population and the development of cities in order to make this type of irrigation farming go and to keep things running down in the south. This was one of the catalysts that led to this denser population down in southern Mesopotamia. Now, what is the difference between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers? Well, the Tigris is a more fast-moving river. It flows to the east, and throughout history, as you get further downstream, it tended to shift, and so the shifting of the river caused difficulties for cities that were built along the Tigris further downstream. However, the Euphrates, on the other hand, was slower. It was navigable, so you could use it to travel to its far western point. It flows within 90 miles of the Mediterranean Sea, and then it bends sharply to the west where it reaches the alluvial plain near the city of Hit. And, of course, we'll talk about that as we move forward in this series. Of course, both rivers originally they emptied into the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf has shifted since antiquity, and now it connects to the Shatt al-Arab, which empties into the Persian Gulf. Now, the flooding season is something that we need to talk about because it's different here in Mesopotamia. It's not as useful, it's not as user-friendly, perhaps, as what you see in a place like, for example, Egypt with the Nile. In the spring, the snow that melts from the Armenian mountains causes a great deal of flooding in April and in May of the year. Because the flooding happens so late, measures have to be taken, precautions have to be taken in the forms of, for example, dikes and levees, in order to protect those green crops from the water. In addition, this late flooding caused increased salinization because water was there standing, which during the heat, and the heat would evaporate the water, which would leave increased salinization. Finally, the mud that was brought by the rivers would consistently clog up the canals that crossed southern Mesopotamia, and so these had to be continually dredged or redug when they became too clogged. And so this was the flooding season actually was problematic for southern Mesopotamia. It was absolutely necessary, but it was not ideal. So, in summation, Mesopotamia was situated in a fertile strip of land between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. Trade was available to the east and to the south, and ultimately to the west. Northern Mesopotamia was a broader region. It was less densely populated. This was made possible by rainfall farming. However, in the south, this was not the case. Rainfall was not sufficient to farm. And so people were required to work together to perform irrigation farming, and this was, again, one of the catalysts to the development of cities, more densely populated cities in southern Mesopotamia. Finally, the flooding season was not ideal in Mesopotamia, and innovations were necessary to not only protect the crops from this late flooding, but to control the flow of water for farming in general in the south. So this is a basic layout of Mesopotamia. As far as the geography is concerned, there's much more that we could say about it, but this is a good introduction to it. So, coming up, tomorrow we're going to talk about the people of ancient Mesopotamia, who they were, what people groups came in, at least that we theorize, what evidence we have for them, and how those people groups varied throughout time. So until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Well, here we are again, part 3. I think Megan's calling them episodes. Episode 3 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. We're reviewing the book by Elio Oppenheim. Today we're looking at the major players that are seen in Mesopotamian history. So first, I'm going to give you some precautionary notes, things that are really important to keep in mind as we move forward looking at historical sources and trying to piece together history. These are important things to remember. Then we're going to look at the major players briefly, because we're going to get into much more detail as we go through this series. And then finally, some of the other influences on the region. So, some precautionary notes. The information that we have comes primarily from documentary evidence. So, When I say that, what I mean is when we're trying to get specific, so much of what we know comes from the texts. And it's difficult through the text to be able to get specific on things like racial or ethnic distinctions. This is very, very difficult. So, I hear people in YouTube videos or, popular books talking about the Sumerians did this and the Akkadians did this. And the difficulty is that, or the Sumerians came from here, or we see the Sumerians doing this. That sort of distinction is extraordinarily difficult, if at all possible, to make, because what we have are the texts to work with, and culture and society the way that it is. There is, well, we won't get into the specifics of it here, but just suffice it to say it is very difficult to try to identify racial or ethnic lines of distinction in antiquity. And when we think about the written language and we think about the text that we're utilizing, it's not even, we can't really even be certain in all cases that the written language represents what was actually utilized in everyday society. In fact, we know that texts retain orthography and pronunciation long after the spoken word reflected that. And this is the nature of language. And so it's important to keep these things in mind. Another thing that we want to think about is the nature of our evidence. So our evidence tends to be more laser-like than lamp-like. And what I mean by that is, when you go into a room and you flip a light switch, it tends to illuminate the entirety of the room. So the lamp may not cast, a high level of brightness on a particular area, but it illuminates the whole. Whereas if you have a laser or even a high-powered flashlight and you hold it close, it's more of a beam than it is illuminating the entirety of a room. And in the same way, or in like manner, our evidence tends to be more laser-like. So an archaeologist goes and excavates at a site and comes down on a group of tablets. And that group of tablets consists of literary texts and hemorrhagies and administrative texts and incantations and omens and blah, 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 and all kinds of things that really illuminate what was going on at that house. And of course, we can extrapolate from the contents of the texts, and we can draw broader conclusions based on other groups. But the point is that we end up getting these pockets, if you want to call them, of information, and they tend to be very, very bright. They tend to be very illuminated. We get a lot of information from these specific points, as opposed to this broad understanding or broad illumination. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't know things, obviously. So we tend to find, as I said, these archives or groups of texts where scholars focus on their area of expertise. And this is what tends to happen, right? So, for example, with me, my dissertation was on the laments, but these lamentational liturgies in Sumerian. So I was trained as an Assyriologist in the broadest sense. So I learned Sumerian and Akkadian and other, Mesopotamian cultural aspects, and I was tested pretty rigorously on those things. But in the end, when I did my dissertation, even though I could read Akkadian from all the different periods, all the different genres, and Sumerian from all the periods and all the genres, in reality, I had a more laser-like focus because that's the nature of a dissertation, generally speaking. So I focused on this group of texts that came from one city during one period, and they were a specific genre. So this is the sort of thing that happens. The problem is that when you try to synthesize the data, it's very difficult because it requires a very high level of expertise in these various areas. So, for example, let's take something like astrolabes, these star charts. And here, as I say them, I have very little experience with them. They're written in Sumerian and Akkadian. thinking of one now that's in Akkadian. It's a very, very narrow part of the field, right? Because they're cryptic, they're very difficult, and they require a great deal of specialization. That doesn't mean that they're not understood, because there are people that study them. They make their career out of studying these types of things. But one not only has to have an expertise in the type of Akkadian or the type of Sumerian that's used to write that text and that genre, but one also has to know something about astronomy, right? And those are two very different fields. And so even in that sense, being able to have an expertise in astronomy and an expertise in that specific type of Akkadian or Sumerian is very, very difficult. And so when you think about these broader issues, like when did the Sumerians come in? How would we, or did they come in? Were they always there? I mean, these are very difficult questions, and they require a great deal of information to be brought together from many different fields. So, oftentimes, sorry, I'm rambling a bit here, but oftentimes you'll have a subject that requires the knowledge of economics, science, religion, or more. And so synthesis requires bringing these experts together and drawing broader conclusions. And it's always the temptation to stay in your laser-like focus, in which case synthesis tends to not happen. Anyway, I guess the bigger point here is to understand the complexities of trying to make assertions about a people group or about a historical period. We have to keep these things in mind. And when you hear people make these broad assertions, and it doesn't seem like there's a lot of expertise or a lot of evidence behind it, they probably have not considered the complexities that we're describing here. Okay. Now that we've spoken pessimistically, let's talk briefly in an introductory way about the major players that existed in Mesopotamia that played these major roles. And again, as we move through this series, there's going to be an entire section of the series dedicated to historical overviews, so I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail here. So in the south, in that southern portion that we were discussing yesterday, below where the Tigris and the Euphrates come close together, you have the Sumerians. The Sumerians are generally identified with the south. Later, the south is characterized by the Babylonians, and in the first millennium by the Chaldeans. In the north, however, you generally associate the north with the Assyrians. At a certain point in the second millennium, you have the Hurrians. Of course, they were there before that, but the Mitanni show up in force in the second millennium, and then ultimately the Arameans come in toward the end of the second, beginning of the first millennium. And these are sort of the major players that we'll see. Again, there are many others that come in and out, and we'll look at a couple of them here. So we think about the Amorites, the Martu. You see them in Sumerian literary texts all the time. They're the ones that are uncultured, and these Martu tend to invade. Martu tend to. That was unplanned. The Martu tend to, be marauders or invaders. That's how they're seen, of course, from Mesopotamia proper. But these are, people that are generally that are going to have a significant influence on Mesopotamia. The Kassites, in the second half of the second millennium, we see the Kassites take over in the south for a period of time, and they have a major influence, but again, it's only for a period. The Elamites, who are off to the east, there is so much influence from the Elamites, particularly when we look at a period like the Old Babylonian period, with surrounding the events, the city of Mari. We're going to go into a great deal of detail about that. But the Elamites have a tremendous influence, and the Gutians. And these are in no particular order. I'm just pulling them out here. But the Gutians, for example, Sargon, Naram-Sin, or the Old Akkadian Empire, deal with the Gutians. And of course, as you'll see later, the Ur-3 kingdom in the late 3rd millennium expels Utu-Hagal, expels the Gutians, and at any rate, they're a major player in the sense that they have a significant influence. They're not a major player, but they have a significant influence on the region. So, how do we summarize this? Writing a history is hard. I mean, that's a good way to say it. This is a difficult task, and we shouldn't give up hope, but we have to remember that untangling the complex web of culture, society is an intermingling that's very, very difficult. There's agency from people to material culture to people, and it's very complex interweaving, and it's difficult to distinguish between the various ethnicities or races in this web, particularly when we're doing it for the most part through textual evidence. So we all need to bear these things in mind. Nevertheless, there are major players that are involved in Mesopotamian history, and we looked at them divided by the north and the south. Again, we're going to nuance that as we go through, and we're going to note the many other groups that have a profound influence on Mesopotamian culture, society, the land, and its history. So, next week, we're going to be looking at the world around ancient Mesopotamia. So we've started to talk a little bit about the external influences. We're going to go into a bit more detail about what was going on around ancient Mesopotamia that not only influenced them, but was influenced by Mesopotamian culture. So, until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back again to our series on ancient Mesopotamia, an overview of the book by A. Leo Oppenheim, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. We are on to part 4, looking at the external influences of the areas surrounding ancient Mesopotamia. We're going to look at the Semitic influx that took place throughout the period of Mesopotamian history, patterns of trade that existed, and finally, Mesopotamian influence, this time going out to the surrounding regions. So there was, throughout the period of Mesopotamian history, a steady influx of Semitic people. They came from the north of Syria, and they had a tremendous impact on both the structure of Mesopotamian society, but also on interactions between those in urban and settled areas and those in the periphery. Some of the Semitic groups that came into Mesopotamia would settle in the more urban areas and take part in the general structure of those cities. However, many remained in the outlying areas, staying nomadic, living in encampments, and this type of tribal structure and organization showed resistance to paying taxes and corvée labor, providing that corvée labor. And in general, these encampments, these settlements in the outlying areas outside of the main urban centers, and generally speaking, these often were a source for unrest and revolt throughout Mesopotamian history. Trade is a fundamental part of Mesopotamian history. We see it going in all different directions. One primary source or direction of trade was with the Persian Gulf and the Indus Valley regions. There was a book that was recently published in the last couple of years, Babylonia, the Gulf region, and the Indus, Archaeological and Textual Evidence for Contact in the 3rd and early 2nd millennia BC by Stefan Larsen and Peter Steinkeller. It's published by Eisenbrons in the Mesopotamian Civilizations series. What you see there is trade. We can see it in the record as early as the 6th millennium, I think particularly beginning in the Ubaid period. And the interactions essentially are with 4 different regions that are mentioned in the Mesopotamian sources: Marhashi, Melucha, Dilmun or Tilmun, and Magan or Makan. And these are all described, of course, in the book. But these regions were a source of, often on to greater or lesser degrees, constant trade. And this continued down to the end of the third millennium from the aspect of the state. So state trade, state organized trade continued down to the end of the Ur III dynasty. And then after that, trade operated more on a private scale. So it continued, but it was no longer state-run. The old Assyrian period, however, in the beginning of the second millennium, was characterized by private trade. So private merchants from the city of Ashur traded tin and textiles for silver with Anatolia. And a trading colony was established there, given its success. And from this trading colony, we have thousands of economic texts, letters, administrative and legal documents, and a variety of other genres. We have a video on this, a daily date on this, that explains it in more detail, so see the link in the description for that. In the second half of the second millennium, we have another significant period of trade. This is international trade, but among the members of the ancient Near East in general. So this is international trade between the members of what we call the Great Powers Club. And this includes Egypt, up into Anatolia, Assyria, Babylonia, amongst others. And this type of trade had significant effects on the what we call Amarna period. You see the description below. There's a link that connects you to our video on the Amarna period. Influence did not come only from the outside in. As a matter of fact, Mesopotamian influence from very early on affected the surrounding regions. I don't have it up on the screen, but you have the Uruk expansion very early on affects the northwest, affects the east. This is Mesopotamia affecting the surrounding region. Oppenheim describes 3 different areas that are affected by Mesopotamian influence: Elam to the east with its capital at Susa, Urartu to the north in the Lake Van region, and off to the northwest, the Hittites with its capital at Hattusha. All of these areas used the Mesopotamian writing system. There was scribal education in these areas that modeled to greater or lesser degrees after Mesopotamian style. The language and the literary tradition went, again, to varying degrees, but with that tradition brought the religious and social influence from Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia not only was influenced by those around, but had an influence on the surrounding regions themselves. So in this case, influence was unidirectional. When it came to language and literary tradition, the influence went from Mesopotamia outward. So in summation, influence went both ways, both in and out of Mesopotamia. Semitic people groups came in and influenced the history and structure of Mesopotamia. Trade took different forms, but resulted in cross-cultural contacts and influence from all of these regions. And Mesopotamian language and literary influence was transmitted to the surrounding regions, having a significant effect. And we see this in biblical texts, we see this in literary traditions from the surrounding regions. Coming up tomorrow, we're going to begin to look at an introduction to Mesopotamian society. We're going to look at, over the next couple of lessons, palace and temple interaction, and just general structure of society. So it should be an interesting continuation of the series, so stay with us. But until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back, everyone, to Part 5 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization, Part 5. Today we're going to be looking at the shape of society. We're going to take a brief look at social stratification, generally speaking, some aspects of slavery, and how to gain social status in ancient Mesopotamia. Again, this is all very general, introductory information, but Oppenheim lays it out in a way I think that is very useful. There is a notable absence of social stratification that Oppenheim identifies. Even for priests and scholars, there is no special elevated status. The palace and temple complexes were the primary organizations of the state, and they're going to play a particular role in social stratification, as we will see shortly. But before we do, let's look at some of the lower ranking people in society. Slaves. So Oppenheim notes that slaves were either privately held or were part of the palace and temple complexes. Now, private slaves could be procured in a number of ways. They could be born in their master's house. They could be purchased. They could be taken in war as spoil, although this was less common. They could be taken as debtors and the wives and children of debtors. And finally, they could be taken from among the foreign nations around. Mostly women, they were taken for their particular skills. There are no particular laws protecting slaves from their masters. Slaves were often adopted by elderly individuals, elderly slave owners, in order to have the slaves take care of them and to see that they were properly buried and so forth. At least by the Neo-Babylonian period, so second half of the first millennium, slaves could have their own businesses. And so you see slaves going out and simply paying their masters in silver. Now, the big thing that Oppenheim points out is that, relatively speaking, there are few privately held slaves. And the reason for that is private homes were not the centers for production. So the means of production were held by the palace and the temple. And there was a cost-benefit ratio to having slaves, and it wasn't beneficial enough from a cost standpoint to keep slaves in the home in order to produce goods. This was accomplished by larger complexes such as the palace and temple, which was more cost effective. So you see relatively few slaves held by private owners, and more, comparatively speaking, by the palace and the temple. Now, how did somebody gain social status in ancient Mesopotamia? Oppenheim notes that religious positions were not considered to be significant as far as gaining social status. Professionals were the ones that were able to be elevated in society. So, in the palace and temple organizations, guilds were formed based on these professions, and these guilds were headed by overseers. Notably were the smiths, the brewers, carpenters. The overseers of these professions achieved a social status, and it's worth mentioning that some of the overseers of these professions, of these guilds, gained a higher social status than others. So he compares merchants, which gained a high social status, one end of the spectrum, to musicians who were on the other end of the spectrum. And so by gaining this professional position of an overseer, it was one of the ways that someone could gain social status in ancient Mesopotamia. So, in summation, there is a conspicuous absence of social stratification. Slaves were both privately held and kept by the palace and temple organizations. Private slaves could be purchased, captured, taken from foreign nations, etc., and were generally not protected by the law. The temple and palace held the majority of the slaves, as they had the means to produce, and their processes were cost effective. Finally, professionals were able to gain some social status as heads of guilds, although some positions had a greater social status than others. So, tomorrow we're going to look at the city versus the open country, a recipe for unrest. So how did the urban dwellers in the city-states, in these city areas, these urban areas, how did they interact with those from the surrounding countryside, and how did those in the countryside foment unrest? What did that look like throughout Mesopotamian history? Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back to part 6 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. Today we're going to be looking at the city versus the open country. Going to try to explain something of life inside the city and out, how conflicts arose between these two groups, and some of the basics of the economy that's found in the city. So, city residents and those in the hinterlands were often in contact with one another, perhaps not those that worked directly in the temple or in the palace, but those that were contracted by the palace or temple organizations, those that traded outside of the city. There was always contact between those inside the city and those in the hinterlands. Often difficult circumstances, particularly economically, would force people out of the city into the countryside. So delinquent debtors, people that were in power that were defeated were often forced to go outside of the city. Also those that defected from the temple or the palace moved out into the countryside. In addition to those moving out of the city, foreigners who came down from the mountains or in from the desert would often join these encampments. Thus, areas outside of the city often became the focal point or the gathering point of disgruntled people or foreigners who had no loyalty to the people inside of the city. When a strong or charismatic leader would emerge from this group, it often led to a revolt, and this revolt would at times lead to the overthrow of the city. We have to then keep in mind that when regimes change due to outside forces, this is not necessarily an invading horde that's coming from afar. It could simply be those dwelling, sometimes for long periods of time, in the hinterlands, waiting for, unconsciously at times, a strong leader to emerge to lead them to overthrow the city. Because of this, kings would work hard to resettle people that had been dispersed, and you see this in royal inscriptions. So given that some economic circumstances would lead people out of the city, let's talk about the basics of the economy in Mesopotamia. So agriculture was the primary basis of Mesopotamian society. To a lesser degree, people would deal in the trade of wool, hair, even though that says hasur, and leather. So you can't get away from textual criticism. It is everywhere, and all of you are experts in it. So they dealt in trade of wool, hair, and leather. And as we mentioned earlier, private households usually did not have sufficient capital. There was not a good cost-benefit analysis that could be done to sustain production in private households. And so the palace and the temple organizations who had sufficient capital and organizational structure and manpower, they were able to farm or be in charge of these large tracts of land or these, dealing in the production of these other goods. So while some smaller plots did exist that could be used by the poor or by shepherds or nomads, most of the land was farmed by the temple and the palace. Now, this was either done by palace and temple workers who were employed by these organizations or by contracted employees. And we'll talk about this in a bit more detail later. And one of the reasons for this, or perhaps the primary reason, was there was significant manpower and organization required to maintain those things that were utilized to do farming, particularly in southern Mesopotamia. So, as we talked about the Euphrates and the salinization that occurred because of the slow-moving water and sitting in basins in the heat, particularly during those summer months when the water would sit and evaporate, you'd get salinization. You'd get silting of canals, which had to be maintained or redug. You had the weakening of dikes, and all of this had to be monitored closely and required great organization and manpower and capital to be able to keep things moving. And so this is why private households, generally speaking, were not able to do this. This was done by the larger organizations. So, in summation, there was often tension between the city and the countryside. Countryside often was made up of disgruntled or foreign people. Strong leaders could lead these people who had no loyalty to those inside of the city. The leaders could foment insurrection and take over that city. The palace and the temple were at the center of the agricultural society in the city. And because of this, it was in the king's best interest to keep stability, equilibrium among the city residents and its hinterlands. Tomorrow, we will take a more detailed look at the Mesopotamian economy. I promise to make it as interesting as humanly possible. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back, everyone, to part 7 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. Today we're taking a closer look at the economy. Exciting topic. We're going to look at farmland, ownership and care, both in the north and the south, the use of silver diachronically, and then finally some differing concepts, or differing ideas on charging interest. So, the ownership and care of farmland can be distinguished in Mesopotamia, go figure, between the north and the south. So again, in the south, there was irrigation farming. They're below the 200 millimeter ISO height. So, rainfall agriculture is not possible in the south. And as we have seen in previous weeks, much of the land, therefore, was owned by the great organizations, the palace and the temple. In addition, to a lesser degree, private absentee owners rented their fields to tenant farmers and collected from them. In the north, however, where there was rainfall agriculture, there were village communities and a type of feudal system. There was a very thin layer at the top with the king, his family, and his high officials. And this type of structure made it possible when an invading force would take command, take over the regime, it would allow this feudal system to stay in place by simply exchanging one regime for another. By the Neo-Babylonian period, which is essentially the middle of the first millennium BCE, the amount and the size of land that was rented out had increased dramatically. And this happened contemporaneously with a decrease in the use of serfs and slaves and other workers by the great organizations, the palace and the temple. And so there was this movement away from the centralized care to more privatization. Now, the use of silver is an important part of the economy in Mesopotamia to understand. As a means of payment, silver was weighed at each transfer. However, early on, particularly in the Old Babylonian period, silver was the standard by which things were measured in value, but things were not generally, Oppenheim argues, paid for or purchased with silver at the actual transaction. However, by the Neo-Babylonian period, extensive vocabulary existed that described the type and the purity of the type of silver, a type and purity of the silver that would be used in an exchange. There was a development of the use of silver over time. Of course, as we would expect, most of the silver was found in the palace or the temple. As a final point, we're going to look at charging interest. So there was an interesting idea, or there was a differing point of view of the concept of charging interest to one's countrymen in the West and in the East. So in the West, we have a text from 𝀭that says, "Give in the meantime the 140 shekels, which are still outstanding from your own money, but do not charge interest between us. We're both gentlemen." 𝀭is in the West. Similarly, in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy 23:20, "You may charge interest to a foreigner," the law says, "but to your own countrymen you shall not charge interest." The idea of charging interest usury was a taboo. However, in the East, you don't see this. In Mesopotamia, you don't see this. For example, in the old Assyrian trade colonies, charging interest was standard practice. So that the old Assyrian traders had no such rules. So there seems to be a distinction between the ideas of charging interest in the East of the ancient Near East and in the West. And Oppenheim has a theory, you can read about it if you like, as to why this might be. But it's just interesting to note why you see this, for example, in the West and less so in the East. So, to recap, the southern farmlands were owned and managed primarily by the temple and the palace. The northern farmlands were feudal in nature, with the king, his family, and his high officials at the top. Silver was the standard throughout Mesopotamian history, but only later was it used in common transactions. And finally, the charging of interest was considered, quote-unquote, taboo, was considered taboo in the West, but not so in the East. Next week, we're going to take a closer look at the palace and temple organizations that we continue to refer to. Try to go into a bit more detail concerning them so that you can have a better understanding of the central role that they played throughout Mesopotamian history. But until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Well, welcome back to part 8 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. We are summarizing the work of Leo Oppenheim. Today we're going to be talking about the great organizations, the palace and the temple. So we'll first look at what they share in common, briefly look at their distinctiveness, and then finally the role of the king who was over these two organizations. So what is it that they share in common? Well, both receive similar income. So income comes from agricultural holdings, be they farmland that was worked directly by temple or palace personnel, or those that were rented out and their renters were responsible for payment. Be they income could also be derived from workshops that were run by the temple or palace organizations, making different types of products. Donations from worshipers, and tribute from allies in order to keep Mesopotamian kings appeased, or from subjugated lands, tribute that was levied against them. That income in both places was redistributed to the palace or temple organizations in order to maintain their rations. Staff could be supplemented by prisoners of war and or indentured servants and their families. And both were considered to be households, household of the god and the household of the king. But they are distinct entities. So because the temple is the household of the god, there is a distinction between that and the king. Both, however, required the servants of each, of both the palace and the temple, to care for the god and the king in similar fashion. So responsible for feeding and clothing and caring for. This was done at both the palace and the temple, but they were considered distinct entities in that sense. Furthermore, and this is probably the more important thing that Oppenheim points out, and that is that the temple operates based on the largesse of the king. So a more powerful and successful king resulted in a grander temple. This is true, of course, not only in Mesopotamia, but also in the wider Near East. So we see this, for example, with Solomon in the Old Testament. Given his great success, the temple was built and it was very extravagant. This is common to the Near East. When your king is successful and he has money to spend, he will spend it on the god, and often spend it on the god. And so the temple would become more ornate, and operations would be more extravagant. Temple rebuilding and care is a subject common to the royal inscriptions. So you see this when you look back through the royal inscriptions, and maybe you can ask Megan about this, as this is her specialization. And looking at these inscriptions and the subjects that they deal with, temple rebuilding and care is very important to the Mesopotamian kings. So speaking of Mesopotamian kingship, Oppenheim goes into a little bit about what kingship is in some detail. Kings were in charge. They were over both palace and temple. Even though the god was the owner and the rightful head of the temple and, of course, of the entire city, the king was placed in charge of his house. Kingship was therefore divine in origin, and you can see this in documents very clearly, for example, like the Sumerian king list. So the Sumerian king list says that kingship descended from heaven and was placed in this city with this king and this king and this king, and then it was taken from that city and taken over to this other city. So the gods were directly involved and responsible for the transfer of kingship, and it was divinely determined. Now, in the 3rd and 2nd millennia, kings often used what's known as the divine determinative. So you see the ding ear sign before the king's name. You see this starting in the Sargonic period and coming down through at least the Old Babylonian period. Kings assumed, in a very real sense, this divine status for themselves. Kings possessed their own melamu, and this is a type of terrifying aura that overwhelms the enemy of the person or deity that possesses it. Gods have melamu, kings can have melamu, but it is only present as long as their kingship is ordained by the gods. Now, there were some distinctions between the Assyrian king and the Babylonian king. So Assyria in the north, Babylonia in the south. The Assyrian king was considered to be the priest of Ashur, who was the Assyrian king was considered to be the priest of Ashur, and because of that, he performed specific cultic functions. He had a very prominent role in these cultic functions. He was given the tribal nature of northern kingship. He was probably considered, Oppenheim argues, a primus inter pares, or like the first among equals. He was surrounded by diviners and physicians because he was to be protected against disease or demonic influence. The Babylonian king, however, did not play this specific role as a priest. The priest of Marduk, for example, he was only allowed to enter the temple once a year, and it was under very specific regulation. The priest would strip him of his insignia, for example, during the Akitu festival. There's a video about that in our daily data. And so, there was distinction between how the Assyrian king was seen in relation to the god and how the Babylonian king was seen. However, Mesopotamian kings were ultimately responsible for the care of their people. So they were responsible for legal protection, for correcting abuses in the society, and ensuring the general welfare of the people. And in this sense, we cannot consider kings to be despots or dictators. They were genuinely, according to the text and according to what we understand from their actions, they were to care for the society. And of course, this was not a completely selfless act. Keeping people free of debt and free of poverty was good all around for the society, which ultimately was good for the king. And so, these were good for all parties involved. So, in summation, many similarities existed between the palace and the temple organizations. The temple was considered to be the household of the god, while the palace was the household of the king, and the care and feeding of the heads of both of these, or the primaries in both of these organizations, was the responsibility of those that worked for these organizations. The temple was dependent upon the success and largesse of the king. So as the king was more successful, so did the temple grow in its extravagance. Kingship was divine in origin, and there were differences between the roles of the Assyrian and Babylonian kings. And the primary difference that Oppenheim cites is that the Assyrian king took on a much more priestly role given his significant or predominant role in the temple in Assyria, whereas the Babylonian king was not responsible for these types of priestly roles and cultic functions. Kings, however, were responsible for the welfare of the people, and they worked very hard to ensure that the people maintained a life free from, as much as possible, kings were ultimately responsible for the welfare of their people. So that gives you a brief introduction to the great organizations, the palace and the temple. Tomorrow we're going to begin to look at the Mesopotamian city and how it functioned during this period of antiquity. So stay with us. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know? Welcome back, everyone, to the next installment of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. This is part 9. We're going to talk about the city in Mesopotamia. So there were early urbanizing tensions that led to the formation and shaping of Mesopotamian cities throughout history. We're going to talk about the early growth of cities, and finally, the typical structure, the makeup of a Mesopotamian city. So there's always been this tendency for people to group together into clusters, into cities. This often happened around watercourses. You see this in the Nile Valley, in the Indus Valley, and in Mesopotamia. However, with this urbanization came this desire for those inside of the city to exercise power and influence over the areas and the people living around the city in close proximity. And this led to strong anti-urbanizing forces from those living around the city. And so this tension between urbanizing and anti-urbanizing forces shaped much of Mesopotamian history when it comes to the city and its development. Now, the early growth of the cities. So Oppenheim attributes early growth of cities in Mesopotamia to increased agricultural production, particularly in the south, as we're going to look at later on. Urbanization took place in the south. As we've discussed earlier, urbanization in the south developed, at least to some degree, centered on this irrigation farming because there was not enough rainfall under the 200 millimeter ISO height for rainfall farming to occur in the south. This required a type of irrigation farming, which required organization, structure, and of course, this type of structure, while more difficult to achieve, also resulted in increased agricultural production. And these two things, increasing structure and organization and the increase in agricultural production, led to the development and growth of early cities. This, of course, required fortification of the centers in which people lived, given these tensions, urbanizing and anti-urbanizing forces, and of course, having this sort of protection, this fortification in a center of power, led to further growth of the city. And then finally, this increased contact between the settled and the tribal areas was a catalyst not only to drive people into the city, but to at times entice them in, given what was going on inside of the city. So these three things, at least these three things, were early factors in the growth of Mesopotamian cities. So in southern Mesopotamia, an interesting feature is that cities formed quite close to one another, often within line of sight. Examples of this would be the cities of Eridu, or Larsa, and Uruk. So what did the typical Mesopotamian city look like? Well, the Sumerian word for city is Uru, Akkadian Alam. The rule was there was an enclosing wall. Of course, this was not required for a Mesopotamian city, but it was extraordinarily common. Cities were built along waterways, which, for obvious reasons, considering the importance of water to the life of a city. And of course, watercourses shifted, which had to be accounted for, and there are grave consequences for the shifting of watercourses when it comes to a city built along its path. An Akitu shrine, a New Year's shrine, was constructed usually with a sacred path leading to it, and it was constructed along a waterway. If you'd like to know more about the Akitu shrine and the festival associated with it, we have a video about that as a daily data. See the link below in the description. There are three parts to a typical Mesopotamian city. The first is the city proper. This was the walled area that contained the palace and the temple and the homes of the royal family and the high officials. Then there was the outer city, which encompassed the other houses, the farms, the fields, all the areas where the natural resources for the city were gleaned. And then finally, the harbor, known as the Karum, Kar in Sumerian. This was the commercial district, or the place where commercial activity took place, and this is where foreign traders would reside. And of course, there are very popular Karums. Karum Kanish is one, the Old Assyrian period. And again, we have a video about this in the Daily Data playlist if you would like to see it. So in summation, there was a tension that existed between urbanizing and anti-urbanizing forces, and this shaped the history and development of Mesopotamian cities. Cities grew because of increased agricultural production, settlement fortification, and continuous contact with the surrounding people groups. Cities generally consisted of a walled center, an outer city, and a commercial district. So that's a very brief look at a typical Mesopotamian city, how they developed, the impetus for development, how they initially grew, and what a typical Mesopotamian city looked like. Tomorrow we're going to begin to look at urbanism in Mesopotamia and some of the forces that led to urbanism in this region. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back, everyone, to episode 10 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. In this lesson, we'll be talking about the city, part 2. As we began to talk about it in yesterday's lecture, we'll continue and finish it here. We're going to take a look at some interpretive difficulties when looking at the city as a whole, noting how cities are often set on a hill, the distinguishing feature of the wall, the importance of the city gates, and then finally the place and position of the palace and temple in the city. So there are some interpretive difficulties that we need to engage with when we think about contextualizing urbanization and the structure and layout of the city in ancient Mesopotamia. First of all, cities often developed and urbanized based on the context in which they were found. And so both people and societal norms had agency on the city had agency on them. And so there's a great deal of interplay and intermingling between all of these factors and forces. And so trying to assign this city to this particular people group or to this particular societal cause is very difficult to do because of the changes contextually that took place in these Mesopotamian cities, given any number of factors. Secondly, urban features were greatly influenced by these changing people groups. This is particularly true given the fact that people groups infiltrated, be it from the surrounding area or from a far-off place. People came in. There was interchange between the countryside and the city. Another problem that we face is that archaeologically it is difficult to access many of these cities. They are in Iraq and Syria, and of course this is extraordinarily difficult at the moment. But even if we did have access to the country, easy access to the country, these cities, the places of these cities, the tells, are not just sitting often abandoned. Other people are living on them. So, you can't come up and say, I'm an archaeologist, get out of here. So it is extraordinarily difficult to even access the cities. But even when you can, and you do get permission and the ability to excavate, the focus generally tends to be on the parts of the city that will generate interest and funding. And so people tend to go to the tops of the hills, right? They go to the place where the palace will be, where the temple will be, and they dig in those areas to pull out monumental architecture or tablets, things that will make it in the newspaper. It is less glamorous, let's say, to uncover all of the streets in the city to determine their patterns. Did they go straight? Did they turn at different angles? Where did the wall run specifically? These are all things that take a great deal of time and will not produce in the general population as much excitement and funding, perhaps, as excavating in these palace and temple areas. So, that being said, there are things that we know about Mesopotamian cities. First, cities were normally founded on hills. This is even when flat, low-lying land was available. And there are a number of reasons for that you will see as we go through these discussions of Mesopotamian history. But being close to the water but not inside of the danger zone when it comes to flooding is one, or at least as dangerous of a zone. Of course, protection from outside forces is another, but there are different reasons. But this is normally what we find. This resulted often in a citadel city, with the palace and the temple having its own wall enclosing it on top of the mound, and then an outer wall around the outer city. When we think about the streets, even on hills, it was ideal for the streets to run straight, and this is something that comes up in the texts. Kings will boast from time to time about straightening the city's streets. The wall was, in Mesopotamia, a distinguishing feature of the city. This was, as we've talked about, something that went around the palace and temple complex, around the outer part of the city, and it was the king's responsibility as the shepherd of the city to maintain it. The king would tear down enemies' walls, which, of course, not only afforded him the ability to access them should they rebel, but also it leveled the city's landscape. It took away some of their prestige, as the wall was something that was to be an awe-inspiring force. It was an architectural feature, and it was designed to instill fear and awe in both enemies and in those that would come and visit or live in the city. The gates, these weren't just places to access the city. This was, Oppenheim argues, a civic center. So there are lots of things that take place at the city gates. One thing that happens time and again at the city gates, both in legal texts and in literary texts, is you see judgment and decision-making. It takes place at the gate. Statues were erected by victorious kings in order to demonstrate their prowess and to, again, as the people entered the city, see this monumental architecture and to be reverent and fearful of the power and support by the gods of the king. Gates were often named according to their functions. So some examples that Oppenheim lists are the Gate of the Metalworkers, Gate of the Sheep and Goats, the Refuse Gate, and the Spring Gate. So this is common in ancient Near Eastern gates and Mesopotamia in particular. Finally, the situation of the palace and the temple is that they were separated from one another and from the exterior wall of the city. Often the temple complex itself, which would include the temple, its storehouses and granaries, living quarters, etc., were surrounded by their own wall. Then, as we go out, the temple and the palace were surrounded by the residential areas of the city. And then finally, a second wall would often run around the outer city in order to protect those residential living quarters. So what can we say in summation? Archaeologically, it is challenging to excavate cities as a whole, and the shifting of people groups makes the interpretation of excavated cities more challenging, more difficult, given the changes that take place in people groups and the agency that these groups have on the city and vice versa. The wall in the Mesopotamian city was a distinguishing feature. and the city itself was usually constructed on a hill, the temple complex and the palace having its own inner wall and the outer city having an outer wall. Gates were active places, often places of judgment, and the palace and temple were separated from the outer wall of the city, and as I said, distinguished by often being surrounded by their own wall. So that's the Mesopotamian city. Again, there's much more that could be said about that, but I think that's sufficient for now, and I think it represents what Oppenheim presented reasonably well. Beginning in the next lesson, we're going to start looking at Oppenheim's brief overview of Mesopotamian history. So I think this is actually going to be really exciting. It'll lay out in a condensed timeline essays, he calls them, on Assyria and Babylonia. So it should be an interesting next couple of daily data. So stay with us. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back again to Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. We're doing a summary of A. Leo Oppenheim's book. This is episode 12. We are looking at his History of Babylonia essay. This is part 2. We'll be looking at Hammurabi of Babylon, someone near and dear to our heart. The fall of the first dynasty of Babylon and the aftermath with the Kassites, and then finally an introduction to the Chaldeans, who appear in the first millennium in Babylonia. So after the fall of the Ur-III dynasty there at the end of the third millennium with Shulgi and his dynasty, the cities of Isin and Larsa held sway respectively in the region. In the north, in Mesopotamia, northern Mesopotamia, Shamshi-Adad I ruled there beginning at the end of the 19th century and held sway over a very large region in northern Mesopotamia. So during the 100 years leading up to Hammurabi's reign, Babylon was fairly insignificant. There was the taking and losing of certain cities, points out the city of Kish, for example. And so Babylon was, relatively speaking, insignificant. Hammurabi's father, Sin-Muballit, really began the trend of bringing Babylon to power. He fought in the south, but he did so primarily because Shamshi-Adad was in the north, and he couldn't match him. When we come to Hammurabi, though, circa 1810 to 1750, following the death of Shamshi-Adad in 1776, Hammurabi began this consistent expansion. He eventually defeats Elam and Larsa to the south, then Ashnuna, and finally the city of Mari. Around 1600, the Hittite king, Mursili I, comes down and conquers Babylon. This brings an end to the first dynasty of Babylon and brings on a dark age of approximately 100 years. Following this dark age, there's an invasive people group who comes and controls Babylonia for essentially the second half of the second millennium. These are the Kassites. The palace organization under the Kassites was revived, so private economic activity significantly decreased, and this instated a type of feudalism. The Kassites were part of that Amarna period Great Powers Club, so Bernaboriash, and you can see some of the intrigue or developments that took place in our daily data video on the Amarna period, this Great Powers Club. In the beginning of the first millennium, around the 9th century, we begin to hear about a people group called the Chaldeans. They lived primarily in the south, in the marshy, swampy areas, and they were divided into houses. You can see them there: Beit Takori, Beit Amukani, Beit Yakin. Beit means house of. Beit Adini, Beit Sha'ali, and Beit Shilani. And we can talk more about those in a later video. There was a general lack of allegiance among the Chaldeans to the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and this led to guerrilla warfare tactics as they were from the southern area, which allowed them to sort of recede into areas that were difficult to get to. They would come out and attack caravans and try to disrupt those established processes with the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And it was very difficult, as we're going to see next in the next daily data, it was very difficult for the Neo-Assyrian kings to control the Chaldeans. So they sought to disrupt the system that was in place, and they were a nightmare for the Neo-Assyrian kings. So in summation, Hammurabi took a formerly weak Babylon and conquered cities in all directions to form his empire. This was in the beginning of the end of the first quarter of the second millennium. The first dynasty of Babylon fell to the Hittites around 1600. The Kassites, following a dark age, ruled Babylonia for the latter half of the second millennium. And coming into the first millennium, the Chaldeans became the major players in Babylonia, acting initially as disruptors to the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Tomorrow, we will look at Babylonian History Part 3, Assyria's Babylonian Problem. So stay with us. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back, everyone, to Part 11 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. We are summarizing the book by A. Leo Oppenheim. Today we are starting the history of Babylonia, Part 1. We're going to talk about the difficulties in writing history in general, and particularly as it relates to the ancient Near East. We're going to look at some of the sources that are used to reconstruct the history, and then finally we'll start with early Babylonian history, and we'll continue the series into tomorrow and perhaps the next day as well. So it's hard to write history, no question about it. There are very few quote-unquote historical texts in the Western sense of the word when we approach the sources that we have extant from the ancient Near East. So there are some texts that do refer to actual events, but they do so for other reasons than simply recording history. Even those texts that are considered historical, they are not free from intention, right? And the intention is not strictly to record history. And of course, that's so often true in history writing today and in any period. There's always an angle, there's always a point. There are things that are put in, things that are left out based on the historian. So, but this is necessarily true because they were not, in this period, intentionally writing history in the Western sense of the word. Royal inscriptions and literary compositions must be used with caution. We'll talk about royal inscriptions here momentarily. But anything that deals with an historical event, something that we have concluded actually took place, we still need to be very cautious because each text is doing something. And you hear me say that a lot in interviews and in discussions with people. What is that text doing? And we always have to ask that question. Quote, I think, from Oppenheim here on page 144 is appropriate. In short, nearly all these texts are as willfully unconcerned with the truth as any other historical text of the ancient Near East. So this sort of summarizes the difficulty with writing history from the period because, again, the motivation, the goal is not simply to record the events and their chronological order. Now, some of the sources that we have, and again, I'm going to go through these very quickly. But some of the chronicles, things that have information about individual events, sometimes they're laid out in more detail than others. Astronomical diaries, so these are celestial phenomena and the event that coincided or correlated with them. And so these are, useful, particularly from a dating standpoint, because if we can identify the celestial event that is being referred to, which of course is no easy task, sometimes we can correlate that to an actual event. But again, you have to use these with extraordinary caution. King lists. So in Babylonia in the south, the majority of the period of Mesopotamian history, the years were counted or identified by year names. And we have a daily data video that cover these things, the dating in Mesopotamia. In Assyria, they used eponyms. So there were eponym lists, and the years were named after the king or his high officials. Dedicatory inscriptions, those that are left in the temple or are buried or inserted into the temple construction as dedications to the gods. These have historical value in the sense that they do note historical events or things that the king did. So we can utilize those, again, very cautiously. And finally, royal inscriptions. So we need to be very careful, though, when we come to royal inscriptions. These are inscriptions that generally speaking, that the kings wrote or kings had written. These were meant for the gods. They often described pious deeds that the king did or conquests, victorious events, battles, those sorts of things, dedications of objects, rebuilding of temples, all these things show up in royal inscriptions. We have to remember that they were not meant for general consumption. They were intended for the gods. And often these texts were written for the king himself. And so they're going to be crafted in such a way that the king would approve of them. So when we look at them for their historical value, we need to keep that in mind. Another quote, which I think is very important, page 153. In all of these instances, references to literary topoi, historical facts, and historical situations are so densely interwoven that the historian is not only faced with philological difficulties, in other words, difficulties of trying to understand what the text says from a linguistic standpoint, but also with the far more complex problems of style and literary influence as they mold and distort the report for specific purposes. Always ask yourself when you come to a text, what genre is this and what is it doing? With that in mind, in that hopeless situation, I think we can still write a good history, obviously, of Mesopotamia. We just have to be very cautious, right? So, Oppenheim's presentation of Babylonian history, followed by Assyrian history. Keep in mind that he's not going to go into exhaustive detail. He's not going to cover every aspect. As a matter of fact, Oppenheim is writing a history for specific reasons. So he's adding certain things and he's leaving certain things out, like every historian does. Just because Oppenheim doesn't mention something in his essay does not mean that it was not an historical reality, right? It just means that he left it out for a particular reason. So there were two climaxes, he argues. Sargon in the beginning of Babylonian history, so the 24th century roughly, and Nebuchadnezzar II, 604 to 562 BCE. The best documented period, or at least an extraordinarily well-documented period, is the reign of the first dynasty of Babylon, Hammurabi and his successors. So this is the Mari period. We will get into, we've talked about this in a little bit of detail in the Mesopotamian history overview video that we did, but we will discuss the Mari period at some point in great detail. But suffice it to say here, it's a period that is very well documented, relatively speaking, and so we know an awful lot about Hammurabi and his successors, and all of the intrigue and the rulers that ruled at the same time. So, when we go back into the third millennium, we see the king 🀭🀭. He comes in at the end of what we call the Lagash dynasty. At the end of succession of kings of Lagash, and 🀭🀭 conquers Uruk, and shortly thereafter is defeated by Sargon. And Sargon of the Sargonic dynasty, 24th century, unifies Mesopotamia in a way that had not happened previously. Political power moved away from the city of Uruk, so the Mesopotamian south. This was a central power. If you read through the Sumerian king list, you see Uruk is a central city, and here Oppenheim notes that political power is moving away from this Sumerian center of power. The palace organization expanded. It was supported by taxation. It was staffed with personnel who were required to give military service. So these are large organizational changes. Even more changes take place under Naram-Sin, his grandson. But nonetheless, this empire building that Sargon and his dynasty did was a huge development in Mesopotamian history. At the end, the city that was Sargon's capital, the city of Agade or Akkad, was overrun by the Gutians, these invaders, and the Gutians brought down the city of Agade in a weakened state. The Gutians were defeated later by Utu-Khegal, the king of Uruk, circa 2112, who under Ur-Nammu and later Shulgi ushered in the Ur-3 dynasty. And the Ur-3 dynasty, of course, was centered at the city of Ur. And the city of Ur then reasserted control and a unifying force over Mesopotamia again. And you see there is a video that we have called the Bala system, which talks about the redistribution, taxation and redistribution system that existed in the core and the periphery of Mesopotamia. You can watch that video. I think it's very enlightening. But it was a major system, and it stayed in place for roughly 100 years. So this brings us to the end of the third millennium. And so to recap it, when we pick up next in the next daily data, we'll see beginning of the second millennium and the changes that take place. But as a quick recap, writing history is hard, and we need to consider the purpose of the text and the motives of the writer. This is important in everything that we do. Sargon, at the beginning of Babylonian history, unified Mesopotamia and then was defeated. The Ur-3 dynasty picked up where he left off, unifying it again, and was then defeated. This pattern will continue throughout Babylonian history, and we're going to see that as we move from the third millennium into the second millennium in the next daily data. So tomorrow, Babylonian History Part 2, the reign of Hammurabi, and the crazy and chaotic time and well-documented period that was the beginning of the second millennium, the first quarter of the second millennium, and all of the interesting things that come because of it. So stay with us. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back, everyone, to episode 13 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization by Elio Oppenheim. We are going through his book, and we are finishing up his essay on the history of Babylonia, today part 3. We're going to come to the end of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, so strap in. It's going to be a bumpy ride. We're going to look at a quick review of the Chaldean tribal groups, the quintessential Chaldean, Merodach-Baladan II, and finally the Neo-Babylonian Empire, how it started and how it ended. So by way of a quick review, the Chaldean tribal groups were made up of houses. Each was headed by a chieftain, and the Chaldeans would frequently change sides during this period of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the first millennium. Whoever it was most advantageous to side with, that's who they were going with, and it was almost always against the Assyrians. They refused to pay taxes or perform services for the state, and they fostered an anti-Assyrian sentiment. And this actually was a catalyst for a pro-Assyrian, a number of pro-Assyrian segments. For example, the city of Nippur were fiercely loyal to the Assyrian Empire for pragmatic purposes. Elam to the east would often help the Chaldeans, providing weapons or aid, as they were interested in a weak Assyria, which is when you have a powerful central empire and you want your freedom as an independent state in the periphery. You want that central power to be weakened. You want it to be dealing with problems at home, or you want it to just not have the military might or the funding to go on campaigns. And so anything that you can do, including helping these Chaldeans to keep the Neo-Assyrian Empire weak, is something that they were very happy to do. Now, the quintessential Chaldean was a guy named Merodach-Baladan II. He appears first in the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III in the late 8th century. We'll get into him a little bit more when we do a more detailed look at Mesopotamian history, but something that you should note, Tiglath-Pileser III is a king that follows a period of weakness in the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and in 745 BCE, when he comes to the throne, he brings might and power back to the Neo-Assyrian Empire. But Merodach-Baladan was a thorn in his side and in kings that came after. So he made Merodach-Baladan II made himself king at Babylon, 721 to 710, with the help of Elam. And Sargon II was preoccupied with dealing with the Elamite army, and he really couldn't do anything about it, although he really disliked Merodach-Baladan being in that position. In 703, Merodach-Baladan again tries to overthrow the Babylonian king with a coalition that he informed, and Sennacherib is eventually able to force him into Elam. But this, the thing that you need to know about this quintessential Chaldean Merodach-Baladan is that he has the ability to strike, set himself up, and then when the pressure actually does come, when the Neo-Assyrian king is actually able to muster enough strength or time or whatever to come down and actually put some pressure on him, he's able to sort of shrink back into the marshes, right? Or go into Elam and get some support, and then come back at the next opportune time. And this is the way that they operated in the region. So it was a really big problem for the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and we're going to do a short series, I think, in the near term, summarizing a book by Brinkman called Prelude to Empire. And Brinkman shows, I think, quite convincingly that the Neo-Assyrian Empire went bankrupt, essentially trying to fight off the Chaldeans and to fight off these problems that were created in the south. So finally, the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nabopolassar comes to fruition. A weakened, bankrupted Neo-Assyrian Empire eventually falls, and the Neo-Babylonian Empire takes its place. Nebuchadnezzar II is a very important and popular, well-known figure as a Neo-Babylonian king. You read about him in the Old Testament text very frequently, particularly in places like Ezekiel. Nonetheless, Nebuchadnezzar II is a very important king, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. At the end, 555 to 539, you have this kind of interesting guy, this king Nabonidus. And Nabonidus was an odd king. He changed aspects of the religion. He kind of went on a little trip, went into Arabia, and sort of left his post as king. And eventually Cyrus was able to walk in 539. It's reported that he came into Babylon without a fight, and the people praised him as being their deliverer. And so this was the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. In summation, the Chaldeans were individual houses that made the lives of Assyrian kings hellish. I mean, that's just what they did. The quintessential Chaldean was Merodach-Baladan II, who would come and go, making problems and shrinking back into the swamps. He would be aided by Elam. He would be aided by the terrain, and he was able to sort of come and go and continuously cause problems for the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Eventually, the Neo-Babylonian Empire succeeded the Neo-Assyrian Empire and was in turn conquered in 539 by Cyrus. Coming up, Assyrian History, an essay by Elihu Oppenheim, Part 1. We'll begin to look at the early Assyrian Empire and how it developed in early Mesopotamian history. So, until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back, everyone, to Part 14 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. We are finishing up our section on the brief history of Mesopotamia and looking today at the history of Assyria. We're going to look at the early period, Assyria's three fronts that they faced over and over again, and then finally a brief look at the Neo-Assyrian period. So Oppenheim breaks up the Assyrian Empire into essentially three sections: before the Dark Age itself, which of course we don't have any information for, and then after the Dark Age. So the early period is, we first have good information from the Old Assyrian period, and of course this is that time when there was trade between Anatolia and Ashur, the trade of tin and textiles, the merchants, where we have letters and contracts, and it's an amazing period, which you have great documentation, and we have a daily data that you can watch to see a little bit more about this period. Following this, we have the time of Shamshi-Adad I, approximately 1813 to 1781 BCE. We've described his reign in previous videos, but he ruled Upper Mesopotamia from the city of Shubat-Enlil, and of course, lots of interesting things about him and his rule and his two sons. But the big thing to remember here in this brief essay is that after his death, as with many kings, his kingdom quickly fell apart. And of course, this is the time in which Hammurabi secures his kingdom there in Babylonia. The Hittites come and conquer the kingdom of Mitanni in northern Mesopotamia and Assyria region. in the 14th century, and this allows Assyria to begin to reassert some control and independence. And it is at this time, following this conquest of Mitanni, that Assyria joins what we know as the Great Powers Club during the period of the Amarna Archives. So, following the Dark Age, we have Oppenheim describes three fronts that the Neo-Assyrian Empire constantly faces. They are, first, the mountain regions and the people that inhabit them. And so there's constant either battling against or guarding against these people groups from the mountains. And this results in colonization in this, what would be considered a buffer zone or a buffer region in between Assyria and the mountains themselves that acts as a barrier between Assyria and the mountain groups. There is, of course, the struggle with Babylonian South. So the problems that we looked at 2 days ago in the last video, where there are repeated attempts by the Assyrian kings to try to quell revolts and skirmishes and problems in the south, which ultimately leads to their demise. And then finally against the west, heading toward the Mediterranean, and you see relentless campaigning to the west. This is one of the hallmarks. It gets to the point where Assyrian kings are campaigning every year, and this often happens to the west. So the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and again, this is going to be broad strokes, very brief. That's what it's meant to be. We will get into greater detail in later videos, but this will be sufficient for now. We do have another slightly more detailed Mesopotamian history video on our channel if you'd like to take a look at that. But here, there are several early first millennium kings, Assyrian kings, that push south and west. And Tukulti-Ninurta I, 𝀭―Paul II. But a big expansion comes under Tiglath-Pileser III. He expands, he reorganizes, and this is really a high point in the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Sargon II spends the majority of his time reconquering areas that were taken by Tiglath-Pileser III and then lost. His son Sennacherib comes to the throne and has to deal with the Babylonian problem, which we've described in the other video. And Sennacherib's sons Ashurbanipal and Shamash-shum-ukin. Ashurbanipal is placed over Assyria, and Shamash-shum-ukin is over Babylonia as a way to try to establish some peace and some stability in both regions. Of course, Shamash-shum-ukin is turned to the dark side and rebels against Ashurbanipal, and there's a civil war that takes 4 years to finally bring an end to. This, of course, puts Assyria in an extraordinarily bad place financially and militarily, and this creates a scenario where Assyria falls by 612 to the Babylonians under Nabopolassar and the Medes. So in summation, there are 3 periods that Oppenheim identifies before, during, and after the Dark Age. The later period saw greater military aggressiveness and expansion. There were 3 fronts that the Assyrians fought on the mountains, Babylonia, and to the west. The Neo-Assyrian period saw expansion, but the south could not be effectively controlled, and this lack of control resulted in its eventual downfall to the Babylonians and the Medes. So that's Assyria in a nutshell. And so now we've looked at, in some detail, Babylonian history, now Assyrian history, And in the upcoming videos, we're going to be following Oppenheim's survey of Mesopotamian religion. So this should be fun. So stay with us. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Well, welcome back, everyone, to episode 15 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. Today we are beginning to look at Oppenheim's presentation of Mesopotamian religion. So we're going to first ask the question, what is Mesopotamian religion and can we write one? Then we're going to look at the nature of our evidence, both archaeological and textual. So, he begins this section of Mesopotamian religion with the title, Why a Mesopotamian Religion Should Not Be Written, which is an interesting way to write the opening of a section on Mesopotamian religion in a survey of Mesopotamian culture and history. His argument is that the nature of the evidence that we have, both archaeological and textual, is not only incomplete, but is difficult, if not impossible, to correctly interpret. Now, before I continue, I'm going to present Oppenheim's view, his chapter, which was debated around the time that it was presented, and I'm going to summarize the position of a counterposition by Botereau in his assessment of Oppenheim's statements about why a Mesopotamian religion should not be written. So I don't want you to think that this went unchallenged, and many people did not agree with him. But I think it is important to present, even if he's being a little bit hyperbolic or a little extreme, maybe. It is very important to understand the things that we need to be careful about when we think about history writing in general and writing about religion as a diachronic whole in specific. So there is the separation that he argues for, and of course it's there, by time and cultural situation or cultural norms. So, we have different cultural context, and we're talking about things that happened anywhere from 3,000 to 2,000 to 5,000 years ago. So, and everything in between. So this is a long time ago in a very different cultural setting. So what is the nature of our evidence? Well, he cites archaeological evidence, buildings and structures, so temples in particular, and the shrines that are involved with those, cultic objects that are found not only in those religious contexts, but in residential contexts, so images, little amulets and charms, those sorts of things. And also iconography, so iconography that we see in reliefs or cylinder seals. These are all things that we can interpret to try to get closer to Mesopotamian religion. The problem is that it's very difficult to understand what those things mean outside of specific information that tells you what those things mean. So he gives the example of a modern day cathedral. And if you, 2,000 years from now, were to walk into a cathedral, let's say in Germany, and you were to see the iconography, you were to see the different, the tables and the benches and the statuettes and, the candles and all these other things that you might see there in the archaeological record, having no direct knowledge of that religious context, it would be very difficult to ascertain what is it that, for example, these stained glass windows mean. What does this indicate? So they would have to rely on things like written textual evidence to describe what those things mean. And outside of that, it's difficult to get further along than a general understanding of this is a religious place, this is where they would have done sacrifice, or in other words, being very precise is difficult, as it would be for an archaeologist 2,000 years from now. So we can identify, he argues, what the general functions were, but not the specifics. And that's important to remember. His quote here, I think, sums it up pretty well. The monuments of a forgotten cult, of a cult we know only through a few written documents, can reveal, even if perfectly preserved, only a fraction, a dim reflection of the cultic activities which they served. And so again, while that might be a touch extreme, it's very important to remember this principle that you can't just see something and say, well, we do it this way now, so that must have been the way they did it then. And you can't make those kinds of connections and assume that you know without direct evidence what something was used for. You have to be very careful. More clear are the textual remains that we have, but even these are problematic. So he cites 3 different types of textual evidence that we can use to get at religious context. One is one of the prayers. So they reveal that the worshiper, one of the things that you can tell from the prayers, and again, this is imperfect in its reflection, but what he seems to be able to ascertain is that they reveal that the worshiper was not greatly affected by the religion, particularly with respect to doing things with his belongings or with his time. In other words, when we think about religion today, there's this great call to sacrifice, to give up things personally in order to, serve God or to serve the religion. And this did not seem to be the case, as indicated by the individual prayers for the Mesopotamian. There are mythological texts, and he has a quote that I thought was appropriate to cite. All these works, which we are wont to call mythological, should be studied by the literary critic and by the historian of religion. And this is difficult. I think this is a difficult pill to swallow for those involved in theological studies. What we want to do is be able to pick up the the mythological text, the religious text, the thing that tells the story about the gods, and be able to just write the Mesopotamian religion based on it. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case. We can't just do that. Literary criticism is required, for example, to try and determine what the text is doing, and this is very important when we think about Mesopotamian mythological texts, because they're doing different things with these mythologies, and trying to ascertain what those things are is very important, and he argues is the job of the literary critic much more so than the religious historian. Finally, the ritual texts. Now, these are much closer to getting at what the actual ritual was, because these are texts that describe what the ritual looked like and what acts were to be performed during the ritual and so forth. But these are not set in stone. So he, without going into great detail here, he cites the recovering of the kettle drum ritual, and we have a video, a daily data video about this. So you can click on that and get more detail on the kettle drum recovering. But this was a very important ritual, and we have texts both from the Neo-Assyrian period, so maybe the 8th, 7th century, and we have one from the Seleucid period in Uruk. And the difference in time there, we have ritual texts from both periods, and while there are many, many similarities, there are also some differences, and he cites those differences to show that even the same ritual that within a millennium or less, within 500 years or so, can really develop. And so we can't just assume that if a ritual was done in the early second millennium, that when we see it in the first millennium, that it's the same ritual. It may be, but there may be differences, and we have to be very aware of the development that a ritual can take. So, summarizing his introduction to Mesopotamian religion, the nature of the evidence for Mesopotamian religion is problematic, and this is especially because of our separation by time and culture. Archaeological evidence is difficult to interpret with any specificity without accompanying textual data. But even when we have textual data, it must also be interpreted, and there are changes through time that we see even in the textual record. So we have to allow for these things, and we have to be careful not to draw wide-ranging, diachronic, generalizing conclusions or make these types of presentations of Mesopotamian religion. We have to make sure that we are cautious as we try to make general statements about how religion functioned in the ancient Near East and Mesopotamia. Tomorrow, we will begin to look at more details of the religion, and we're going to start by addressing the care and feeding of the gods. So stay with us. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back, everyone, to episode 16 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. This is our trip through all the basics of ancient Mesopotamia by A. Leo Oppenheim. Today we are in part 2 of Mesopotamian religion. We're looking at the care and feeding of the gods. So we're going to begin by identifying some of the biases that we need to watch out for as we approach this topic. Then think about the role of the cult statue, or the idol, as it were. And then finally, its creation and indwelling. And once we can get these 3 things under our belt, then we can actually see why it is that these statues, these gods, needed to be cared for. So some of the biases that we need to watch out for that Oppenheim points out. First of all, idols and idolatry are heavily weighted terms. So when we think about idols, we think about passages, for example, from the Old Testament and how wicked and awful they are, and those sorts of things can make us think very poorly of them, or maybe even shy away from them in general, simply because of the negative connotation of that term idol or idolatry. Secondly, in our modern understanding of how science works and how the world around us works, it can be difficult to see a cultic statue or an idol through the eyes of a worshiper. And that's something that's really important to try to do as much as possible, to understand how that cult statue functioned and what it meant, is to be able to see it through the worshiper's eyes, if at all possible. Finally, there can be this idea of general disregard for cultic statues, not just because of the term idolatry or idol, but also because the ones in Mesopotamia are kind of boring, right? I mean, they're a normal shape. They have a rather plain appearance. And so it's not this big flashy thing that draws our attention. So we need to just be careful when we come to the study of the cultic statue and the rituals that go on around it, that we keep these biases in mind. Okay. What was the role of the cultic statue? The cultic statue was central to worship in Mesopotamia. We see this in the centrality of the worship of the cult statue in the temple. There's a temple in every city. And the presence of cheap replicas of these cultic statues in residential contexts. The statue functioned in 2 primary ways in and around the temple. First, there was a more stationary function in the temple. So it was in the temple, and there were sacrificial and care and feeding rituals that were performed around it and to it. But then there was this more mobile role or function that the cult statue served, and that was internal and external processions and ceremonies that were connected with the temple and the city. And so you see the cultic statue sitting in place and having rituals done to it and around it and you see it going on procession and participating in ceremonies. And in every case, the god remains with the statue. Let's talk about the creation and the indwelling of these cult statues. So most statues were made of precious wood. There were some, depending on the context, that were plated in gold. They were adorned with various garments, types of clothing, and accoutrement. And this would include tiaras or any number of things. It is important to remember that the deity was essentially present in the statues. So when the cult statue was in place, the god was there. When the cult statue moved, the god went with it. And so when a cult statue went into captivity, when the city was conquered and the statue was taken away, the god went with it. Gods could, however, at the same time exist in the statue and move about in the mythological cosmic realm. That's important to remember. There were two primary criticisms of idols, and I'm thinking specifically here of the Old Testament, and they were, although human in form, they can't really do anything, right? They can't do the things that humans do, like see and hear and walk and talk. They were just dumb idols. In addition, the prophet said, these statues, you made them, right? These idols, you created them, and now you're worshiping them. Interestingly enough, and we have a video about this, so I won't go into any detail about it here, but there were a number of rituals that would allow those that created, quote unquote, the cult statue to actually say, no, we didn't. The gods did. And there were a number of rituals that were performed in order to make that a reality in their religious context. So statues were created in sacred temple workshops, and they were subjected to what I'm calling the enlivening rituals. So the 𝑀IS-P, to name one, but there are others. But please see our video on how cult statues were created and brought to life by the gods. So, in summation, we need to ensure that when we approach a study of the cult and cult statues, that we set aside these biases that we might have when we think about things like idols, right? Because that can have a very negative connotation. Cultic statues played a central role in worship, both in place and on the go, in the procession. And finally, although the statues were relatively simple and plain, statues were believed to be made by the gods and indwelled with the essence of the god. This would lead to the requirement of care and feeding, because if the god was present in the statue, the belief was that the god needed to be fed and clothed and cared for. So, in the next video, we will take up part 2 of the care and feeding of the gods and talk about some of the specifics of how these cultic statues were cared for. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?
Hello everyone, Megan here today. I'm giving Josh the day off because he works far too hard and he needs a break. So today you have me, lucky you, and we are going to be continuing the series on Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. This is episode 17. We are making some progress here, and we're going to look at Mesopotamian religion. This is part 3, and we're looking specifically at catering for the divine. So a brief overview of what we're going to be looking at. We're going to consider similarities between the god and the king, the feeding of the god, where this food came from and what it was for, exactly how mealtime works when you're a divine cult statue, and then exactly how the god was thought to consume the food that he was provided with. So, from the 3rd millennium onwards, there was a tendency, Oppenheim argues, to make gods more human. Many people have noted in some of our videos the similarities between Mesopotamian gods and humanity. They throw tantrums, they have love affairs, they form relationships, they can be petulant and kind and cruel. All the variety that we see in human behaviour was understood as being in the behaviour of the divine realm as well. So it only makes sense that human worshippers understood their deities as living much in the same way that they did. And of course, if you're a god, you're not a common person working in the fields. You are imitated by the highest form of human existence, which would be the king. So the god's sanctuary, the temple, was understood as a palace, and in the same way that it was actually quite difficult to gain access to the king, it could be quite difficult to gain access to the god, unless of course you were a priest or a member of the elite. As the king had members of his court and officials to serve him, so too did each god have their own officials in the form of a priesthood who made sure that the temple ran smoothly, looked after the needs of the god, all the kinds of things you would expect to be necessary for an elite-style life. Both god and king relied on others for the basics of existence, including food and clothing, and the gods, in the same way that the king did, received other individuals to their home as a guest. So a king might receive a diplomatic visit from another state, another city. The cult statue received other cult statues, family members, friends who were just visiting from the neighbouring temple. And finally, god and king would go on royal or religious processions around their territory, kind of show their faces, meet the people, and this was an important part of many temple rituals. So where exactly does a god get this food from anyway? Well, food products were brought to the temple both for the god and also for the temple personnel in the form of rations. These people worked in the temple, they kept the books, they performed all the necessary rituals, and they received food rations as part of their compensation. The temple also received food surplus, which was then used to trade for other commodities that were required. The god would receive a morning and an evening meal. This was large enough to feed the god, the king, and all of the temple personnel. It wasn't just enough simply for the god to eat, quote unquote. There was enough food there for everybody. So the mealtime of a god, as you may expect for an entity that is viewed as the supernatural protector of a realm and also the divine counterpart to the king, mealtime was quite a complex affair. A table would be placed before the divine statue. Water was provided before the god so that the god could wash if necessary. Beverages were set out. Cuts of meat served as the main dish, and then fruit was the final course. There would be dinner-time entertainment in the form of music. Then the plates would be cleared and water was provided so that the god could wash up after its meal. Now, obviously, a cult statue is not going to physically consume food. The ancient people were not stupid, they understood this, they didn't try and pretend otherwise. So exactly how did this work? Well, people thought it worked by something called transubstantiation. So the god may not physically consume the food, but it was still sustained by it. Food could also be ritually waved before the deity's eyes so that the god could kind of take whatever sustenance was required without having to physically consume the items of food. This links into what you see in some scholarship as the importance of the gaze of a cult statue. A lot of votive statues that we have from very early in Mesopotamian history have these very wide staring eyes, and there's an understanding among scholars that this is an important feature for the communication of votive statues and the cult statues. Maybe the gaze of the god was thought to bestow a blessing on people, on objects. This isn't an isolated event, deities consuming food through their eyes. This is wrapped up in the importance of visual contact. And finally, the food that the deity ate was thought to have been blessed and was then given to the king to be eaten again. So as the deity's representative on earth, the king had the privilege of consuming this blessed food. In summary, god and king were very closely connected and treated in a very similar manner. Food was provided to the temple by the people and by the state for several purposes, including the consumption by the deity and as food rations for temple personnel. The god's mealtime was a very important event with ritual and performative aspects, and while the god didn't physically consume food, it was still very much understood to be sustained by it. Coming up on Monday, the gods of Mesopotamia. And remember, always ask, how do you know that?
Well, welcome back, everyone, to part 18 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Mesopotamian gods. What was the Pantheon like, and how can we describe it in terms that are understandable to us some 2,500 to 5,000 years later. So we're going to look briefly at the names of the gods and the difficulties that are associated with identifying them, some of the old or primary deities, the astral deities, and then other prominent deities that figure in the Pantheon. Of course, we're not going to cover every Mesopotamian deity. That would take far too long and be extraordinarily difficult, as you will see. So the names of the gods, there is a very long tradition of changes that take place to the understanding, the Mesopotamian understanding of the divine throughout their history. So through syncretism, hybridization, and the plethora of local and minor deities, many names have been preserved, have been changed, have been modified throughout Mesopotamian history. These names were collected and studied in scholarly divine name or DN lists. And some gods are only known through their use in personal names. So people used the names of deities in personal names, and some of them are only preserved there. At times, deities were only mentioned or identified as the lord or lady of the city, but they're not identified by name, making it difficult, again, to study and identify them. But this leads to some of the ones that we do know a fair amount about. So some of the older or main or primary deities are An, Akkadian Anu, the sky god, whose temple was Eanna, of the house of An, the temple of An in Uruk. Enlil, who was the god of what Oppenheim calls the substrate region. So if you think about An being the sky god, and as we'll see in a moment, Ea or Enki being the god of subterranean waters, in the middle is what Enlil presides over. So he's over the earth and the region maybe of the lower sky. Maybe that would be a fair way to say it. But the god of the substrate region, whose temple was Akor, the mountain house of Nippur. An and Enlil throughout time become more misanthropic. So, particularly Enlil, you see him really hating humanity in a lot of ways, and he's sort of the antagonist in many of these myths. Enki, the god of the waters that surrounded the world. If you haven't seen our video on the Babylonian map of the world, I encourage you to take a look at it. It shows what we're describing here. But he's the god of the waters that surround the world and that exist beneath it. And his temple was the Eabzu, the house of the Abzu in Eridu. Prominently featured are the astral deities, so Utu, Shamash, the sun god. He had temples both in Larsa and in Sippar. The moon god Nana, Akkadian Sin. He is, of course, the moon god with his temples in Or and Haran. So just as a brief note, if you think about in the Bible where Abraham is said to have come from, he comes from Or, and he makes a brief stop in Haran. So I think that should clue you in to perhaps the deity that he primarily worshipped. Then there is Inanna. She is represents the Venus star. She is the daughter of An and the goddess of love and war. We've mentioned her any number of times. This is Megan's favorite deity, and her temple was the Eanna in Uruk. Finally, there are a couple of other gods that we want to draw attention to. First, Adad. He is the storm god. He shows up a lot, and there's a lot of modification to his name and his identification throughout the influx of Semitic people groups into Mesopotamia. So you'll see changes to his name, but this is the storm god. Ashur, the god of Assyria. And the interesting thing about Assyria and its priesthood is that Ashur identified the priest, his high priest, as the king of Assyria, which is very different from what we see in Babylonia. Marduk, who is the god of Babylon, and later in the first millennium becomes the primary deity, one of the two primary deities of the first millennium in Mesopotamia, alongside of Ashur. There is Nergal, who rules the underworld with his spouse Ereshkigal. And then finally Dumuzi, who we could say a number of things about, but he is a major theme in the lamentational liturgies and in lamenting in general in Mesopotamia. So, in summation, the Mesopotamian gods are difficult to pin down. It's difficult to identify some of the aspects of them, family ties, those sorts of things. There is a long tradition of changes throughout Mesopotamian history that makes this difficult. The old or primary deities are at the head of the Pantheon, and the astral deities were prominently featured, including the sun and moon, the Venus star. Other deities were also influential throughout Mesopotamian history, though this varied to greater or lesser degrees, depending on the time and place. So, that's the Mesopotamian Pantheon in a nutshell. In our next video, we'll take a look at the diviner and his role in ancient Mesopotamia as it pertained to figuring out what the gods were trying to tell the people. So stay with us. But until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back, everyone, to part 19 of our series, Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. We are continuing with Mesopotamian religion, part 5. This is divination, communicating with the gods. Today we're going to look at what was divination, how did the diviners communicate, and how did the gods communicate back, and finally some of the basics of the techniques that were used. So, what was divination? I thought it would be good to simply quote Oppenheim here, as his definition is actually precise and very useful. A technique of communication with the supernatural forces that are supposed to shape the history of the individual as well as that of the group. It presumes the belief that these powers are able and, at times, willing to communicate their intentions, and that they are interested in the well-being of the individual or the group. In other words, that if evil is predicted or threatened, it can be averted by appropriate means. In short, what he's saying is that the gods, the Sumerian, the Mesopotamian pantheon, was both transcendent in that they were outside and above, separate from humanity, but they were also immanent in the sense that they were concerned about individuals, they were concerned about the people groups, and that they were willing and able, depending on the circumstances, to communicate either their good or bad intentions, or willing to answer questions about the success of a venture or the future prospects of someone's love intention, or any of these issues that the people were able to ask the gods about. So there was this immanence, this relationship in a sense that the gods would have with both the individuals and the people. So, often you will see a king asking the gods, should I go on this campaign? Will I win if I go fight this group? The person that was responsible for being the liaison, the intermediary between the gods and the person asking the question, was the diviner. He had scholarly training in how to read the signs, how to interpret them, how to ask the questions correctly in order to get responses from the gods that were reliable. And so this is the art of divination. And today and Friday, we're going to be looking at some of the specifics of how divination took place. So how did the gods communicate? Well, there were two ways: provoked communication and unprovoked communication. In other words, communication that was solicited by the diviner on behalf of the individual or the group, and communication that the gods simply made in and of themselves through natural phenomena without being asked. So provoked, asking specific questions or requesting signs that would portend certain types of future events, whether they be good or bad. And then unprovoked, natural phenomena in the world around them that would be interpreted by a particular code. So, let's put this in more understandable terms in case it's not understandable. This is the difference between asking your teacher or your professor a question about something in the homework specifically, which would be a provoked form of communication. Excuse me, Professor so-and-so, how many questions will be on the exam on Friday? That would be a provoked communication. Unprovoked would be you're sitting in class and your professor comes up and says, I need you to know that you're going to fail this semester if you don't do better on your homework. That would be unprovoked, something that the professor decided to take it upon themselves to communicate information to you, particularly about the future. And that's sort of what's going on here. The gods could be asked specific questions, and they could also communicate in an unprovoked way through the natural world. Now, how would these signs, how would the answers to these questions or this communication that was unprovoked be interpreted? How would it be understood by the people? Well, this is where the diviner, the Akkadian Baru, this is where he would come in. There were these long lists of omens, the Latin for warning. These omen compendia, they dated from the 2nd and 1st millennia, and they essentially were long lists of, if this happens, then this will happen. And we'll talk about this more on Friday, but these are the means by which the diviners were able to interpret the communication of the deities. So some of the techniques, Oppenheim lists operational divination and magical technique. So operational divination would be direct questions. So he says, quote, the diviner offers the deity the opportunity of directly affecting an object activated by the diviner. Basically what he means is the diviner would take an object, and we'll talk about what those are in some more detail on Friday. I list a couple here. But he would activate, he would ritually prepare and, what's another word for activate here? He would prepare and set in place, maybe, ritually, an object on which the god could act. So here, this is it's a type of provoked question, or a provoked communication, because the diviner is asking the question. He's requesting that the god act upon, for example, oil that is poured on water. So oil would move along the surface of the water, and the way that the oil appeared on the water, the shape or the movement, this would be interpreted by the diviner as communication by the god. Also, if there was a censer and smoke emanated from it, and it was activated ritually by the diviner, then the god could move the smoke around in whatever way he or she saw fit, in order to communicate a message to the diviner or to the individual through the diviner. So the god manipulates the oil and or the smoke to send a message to the person making the request. Another technique he calls the magical technique. The deity produces changes in natural phenomena, that is, wind, thunder, and the movement of the stars, these are examples, or affects the behavior or the external or internal features of animals and even human beings, end quote. So essentially, these are, generally speaking, unprovoked. They can be provoked. We'll talk about this later. But they're, these natural phenomena are often unprovoked things. But something happens. For example, there's an eclipse, or the stars have a certain feature, or a particular type of storm occurs, and this is taken and interpreted by the diviner as a message from the gods that can be interpreted and relayed to humanity, to the people. So, for example, an eclipse often indicated that the king was going to die, let's say, and so certain things could be done to prevent that. We'll talk about that in just a second. These can be provoked or unprovoked, and again, the omen lists are used to interpret the signs and so that they could be understood correctly. So in summation, two-way communication was available to ancient Mesopotamian diviners, and thus to the people. Gods could respond to questions or could portend good or evil through natural phenomena, and the omen lists provided the diviner the means to interpret the signs from the gods. Interestingly enough, this, as you see, for example, in the book of Daniel, this places the king or whoever is making the request of the gods at the mercy of the intermediary, right? So he has to trust the intermediary that they are interpreting not only correctly, but they're not lying or manipulating the answer to suit their own intentions. And so you see in the case of the Neo-Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, one of the things that he does is he's known for setting up this library. Part of the reason he does this is so that he can bring all of these omen compendia and all of these means of interpreting the signs from the gods into one place, so that he can, in a sense, check, at least verify that some of these things that were being said by the diviners were accurate or true. And there's something else I was going to talk about. Oh, well. So, that is an introduction to the ways in which the gods could communicate with humanity. Oh, that's what I was going to say. Just because an ominous event was predicted or warned about through a sign, that does not mean that event was necessarily going to take place. In other words, there were certain rituals that could be done. There were certain actions that could be taken on the part of the individual or the group that could avert that disaster, avert that event that was portended, that was to take place from the gods. So a good example, and we have a video on this in our daily data, is the substitute king ritual. So if an eclipse happened, for example, which portended the death of the king, a substitute king could be ritually put in place, and that would allow the gods to exact that penalty, or not even penalty. They could take out they could perform that action, that death, that killing, on the substitute king in order to fulfill that predicted event, and not actually do it on the real quote unquote king. and that would allow that disaster to be averted as far as the actual king was concerned. And so there were rituals that could be done to ward off the evil, to ward off the coming disaster. And so that was a significant portion of understanding these communications. So a significant reason for making these communications so that they could actually avert the disaster that was to come about. So on Friday, we're going to look at Divination Part 2, some of the more specific means of communication. So we've looked at oil and water and smoke, but there were other things, many other ways that communication took place, and we're going to take a look at those in a bit more detail, so stay with us. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Well, here we are again in episode 20 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization by A. Leo Oppenheim. We are summarizing his book, which is an excellent introduction to Mesopotamian culture, religion, and geography as well. So today we are in part 6 of Mesopotamian religion. This will be the final part of the section on religion. We're looking at part 2 of divination, communicating with the gods. So more specifics about divination. We're going to look at an introduction to omens, messages that are written in animals, and then finally the broad category of unprovoked communication, which can come in a variety of events in the natural world. So let's take a look at some basic forms of omens. Here are a couple from the series 𝀭which is if a city. It's named after the what we call the first line as the incipit. So 𝀭Tablet 1. There are, I think, 107, if not more, tablets in 𝀭This is Tablet 1, entry 23. If a snake falls in front of a man who is bringing a lawsuit, his suit will be in existence for a long time. So you can see in the first part, what we call the protasis, you see an event taking place. And in the apodosis, the second part, you see the result, the thing that will take place, the warning, the omen that is coming because of the event that takes place. In addition, if a white fungus appears in the pathway to a man's house, that house will have trouble. So this is also 𝀭Tablet 12, entry 19. These are constructed very similarly to legal code entries, or code is the wrong word, the entries in legal text. So here are a couple from Codex Hammurabi. If a man should kidnap the young child of another man, protasis, he shall be killed, apodosis. If a man commits a robbery and is then seized, that man shall be killed. So you can see that they're constructed very similarly. And again, they are formed with the protasis if, and then the apodosis then. So if X happens, then Y will happen. The apodosis is a warning, and that should be, we really need to make that clear here. It's a warning of things to come that can be averted if the appropriate rituals are performed. That's very important for these omena. So some of the messages, the provoked messages that can be written in animals, and we talked on Wednesday in the last video about some of the provoked messages, the media that can be used. We talked about oil and water and smoke that comes from a censer. But very, very common is the use of an animal as the medium upon which a god can write a message. So the diviner will ask the god to write their answer on the entrails of the animal that he is sacrificing. So The diviner will examine then, after killing the animal, the various parts of the body of the animal, the various organs. So this could include the liver, the lungs, the windpipe, the gallbladder, and the intestines. What they're looking for are variations from the norm in the shape, state, or coloring of these organs. And there are a number of illustrated tablets, sometimes that are actually shaped like the organ that is being examined. So, for example, there's a Babylonian liver omen that actually is in the shape of the liver, and each of the quadrants or each of the sections in the liver are areas that you would look for discoloration, and there are messages written in each one that would indicate what the omen is, given the discoloration in that area. Finally, omen series are often based on the part of the animal that is being examined. Now, there's also a plethora of unprovoked communication in the Mesopotamian diviner's corpus, and these include, but are not limited to, malformed newborn animals. So, for example, we have the series 🀭, which means if a newborn animal something. So this is, again, we name the omen series after the first words of the first entry. So if a newborn animal, for example, has 5 legs instead of 4, then this will happen. And so there's a whole list of malformed newborn animal omens in the series 🀭. Events that take place, strange events that take place in cities or houses, the movements or behaviors of animals, fire, there's agriculture, all kinds of things, are found in the series 🀭. We looked at a couple of them on the first slide of this presentation. So 🀭 means if a city, and so again, that's the first omen in that series. So that one is if a city is set on a height, and I think it's a bad omen if it's set on a height. There are astrological signs in the series Enuma Anu Enlil, when Anu and Enlil, that's what that means, and that's the first line of the tablet series. These are signs in the heavens. Dreams we want to mention here as well. They can be obviously provoked or unprovoked. If you remember from the very famous Gilgamesh epic, when Gilgamesh and Enkidu are going to the cedar forest to kill Humbaba, there are a number of dream huts that are set up in a series of the text where they are provoking a dream. And of course, they are ominous dreams that come to Gilgamesh that Enkidu sort of reinterprets as good things to come. But that's where that comes from. There are also unprovoked dreams that the gods can just bring. And of course, you also see that in the Gilgamesh epic. So, all right, in summation, omens are constructed in a fashion that is similar to entries in legal texts. So there's a protasis if and an apodosis then. So if X happens, then Y will happen. Messages are often provoked in animals. This is one of the Steve Tinney, Dr. Tinney at the University of Pennsylvania said in one of his lectures, it was a bad time to be a goat in ancient Mesopotamia, and that was the case. So, the goats are often used as this provoked means of communication with the deity. They would kill it and look for different shapes or discolorations or whatever in the various organs of the animal. Finally, a number of unprovoked signs can come in natural phenomena, including malformed newborn animals, events in cities, houses, animals, etc., also in the heavens and in dreams. So omens were a very important part of Mesopotamian religion in that this was one of the primary means of communication with the gods. And so having someone that was skilled, trained, a scholarly individual who could read these signs, provoke these signs, and communicate with the gods on your behalf was extraordinarily important and, of course, integral to really daily life in Mesopotamia. Coming up, writing and the scribal art in Mesopotamia, the next section in Oppenheim's book, so you don't want to miss that. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back, everyone, to part 21 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. We are moving on past religion and into writing. So writing in Mesopotamia. There are only a couple of chapters left, if I remember correctly, and so we're coming to the end of this series. Stay with us. After this series, we are going to get into sex and eroticism in ancient Mesopotamia. So should be a really great series. But today, we are going to look at an introduction to the writing. So we're going to look at the major writing systems, what I like to call the way of clay, and the many uses for writing. So the three major writing systems in the area that we're calling the ancient Near East would be, of course, the very well-known Egyptian hieroglyphic script, the somewhat later Mediterranean alphabetic scripts, and then, of course, the one that is most pertinent to our studies, and that is Mesopotamian cuneiform, or wedge-shaped writing. And we'll mention this again. You can look there at the bottom of your screen. That is wedge-shaped writing. That's cuneiform. So they would take a stylus and impress it into often wet clay. Sometimes they would, incise things into stone or something. But clay, what? So clay is the medium that is extraordinarily common in ancient Mesopotamia. Many hundreds of thousands of tablets are formed out of clay. And again, it's a relatively easy to find, cheap, very, very durable medium to use. And of course, for us, it's fantastic. We're so glad that they used it because when it dries, or when it's even better, when it's fired, clay is, very easy to preserve. And relatively speaking, relative to something like papyrus or parchment. So tablets are formed out of clay, usually, roughly hand-shaped. Some are bigger, some are smaller. But sometimes they can be covered with what's called a slip, and it's just a moist, thin layer of mud that goes on the outside that allows for greater precision with the wedges so that you can write more finely. They were impressed with a stylus, either of reed or of wood. Of course, the gods use a lapis lazuli reed stylus. A lapis lazuli reed stylus, a lapis lazuli stylus. So shapes were formed to form logograms, later syllables and determinatives. And we'll get into that in a little more detail, I think, in the next episode. If you want to know more about the basics of the writing system, Megan has a phenomenal daily data. The name I think is introduction. Nope, it's something about writing. I can't remember the name of it. And as I said, it's extraordinarily durable compared to papyrus, parchment, leather, wood, etc. So there are many uses for writing. Oppenheim lists a number of them. I'll go through them. There are administrative texts, legal documents, texts that record mythology, annals, and scholarly traditions. So let's take them one by one. Administrative texts. The early organizations, the palace and the temple, required record keeping. When you had people bringing 2 sheep and 1 goat into the temple as a tax or as tribute or whatever, you needed to have a scribe there. You needed to somehow record the transaction, both incoming and the receipt, so that the temple needed to know, for example, how many sheep and how many goats they had taken in. And instead of walking out to the pasture every time you wanted to know that, they would just, they wrote it down. They used writing for record keeping, also to generate receipts for people that brought those goods to the temple, and for other transactions. So it was necessary to document this incoming tax, tribute, yields, to track outgoing distributions and rations. And so administrative writing, administrative texts were a very important part of the bureaucratic system, and writing was used from a very, very early stage to track bureaucratic transactions. Legal documents. So we have evidence. We have extant Sumerian, Akkadian, and Hittite legal texts. They're often referred to as codes. Of course, they're not codes, but we've talked about that in other places. But we do have legal documents, so writing was used for that. Oppenheim cites two of the purposes for putting these laws into writing. One was replacing and formalizing these oral traditions and procedures that were used in their legal system. And two, aligning and defining legal practices with respect to current social norms. So these legal texts functioned in such a way to freeze or to formalize these oral traditions and procedures, but also to bring them into alignment with what was contemporary at the time. Mythological texts, what he refers to as sacred lore. So I thought a quote here was actually really useful. Quote, a record of the story of a deity, this is what he's calling the sacred lore, of a religious figure or of an ethnic or otherwise coherent unit, inasmuch as such a story is incorporated into the ideology that sustains the circle of worshipers and the congregation of believers. In other words, what are their religious texts? Records of this type are written down for the purpose of maintaining a corpus of traditions, beliefs, and precepts under changing social conditions or under outside pressure. In other words, it is designed to freeze their traditions, to make it, and this is one of the things that religious texts do. You see this, for example, in Latin in the Roman Catholic Church. Not that I have an expertise in that or anything, but those traditions were frozen and had great sustainability diachronically. So that's what he's referring to as the sacred lore, these mythological texts. Annals. So early bureaucratic documents, the ones that we were talking about earlier, were often dated, right? They needed to be. Legal texts were dated. And so these dating systems were often based on year names or name of a high official or the king. And these lists were formed based on the sequence of year names or of eponym lists, of eponyms. And so you have year name lists, eponym lists, and these annals, the annals which are used, these are texts that can be cautiously used by modern researchers to reconstruct history, particularly sequential reigns of kings, and of course, because of some of the information that's contained in the annals, outside of simple year names, we can get at least to some degree further specificity in historical writing. Scholarly texts. We talked a couple of... we spoke recently about the art of the diviner and his role in ancient Mesopotamia. Those practices were documented. So the practices and the tools of the diviner, diviner's reports, these things are written in these what we call scholarly texts, the movements of the planets. These are texts that are part of the scholarly tradition, particularly in the first millennium, which uses to a much greater degree logographic forms to ensure that only the initiated can read and interact with these scholarly texts. Some other uses for writing, we have letters from many different periods, Text for public consumption, for example, Middle Babylonian kudurus. These are what we call boundary stones. There's, of course, a lot of writing and debate about those, but designed, at least to some degree, for public consumption. Royal inscriptions, of course, these were not for public consumption. At least generally speaking, these were for the gods. Okay, in summation, while there were other major systems of writing in the ancient Near East, the plethora of remains in Mesopotamia are the result of the high level of preservation of the cuneiform clay tablets. Cuneiform, this wedge-shaped writing, found many, many uses, including, as I say here, everything from letter writing and administrative documentation to the mythical and scholarly traditions of the scribes and the scholars, particularly in the first millennium. Coming up on Wednesday, we're going to take a look at the Mesopotamian scribe and his craft. So a bit more detail about what the scribe did in particular. We've looked at the uses of writing. Now we're going to look in more detail at the scribe and his profession. So stay with us. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back, everyone, to episode 22 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization, the summary that we're doing of the book by A. Leon Oppenheim in his introduction to Ancient Mesopotamia. This is part 2 of writing in the ancient Near East, in Mesopotamia in particular, and we're looking today at the scribes and their craft, a more detailed look at those that generated the majority of writing in the ancient Near East, in ancient Mesopotamia. So, what was a scribe? The languages that the scribes used, and then finally some of the basics of scribal practices. So what was a scribe? Well, in Sumerian, a little Sumerian lesson today, the word dub means tablet, and the word sar is the verb to write. So a dub-sar is a scribe, literally a tablet writer, one who writes tablets. Scribes were an integral part of the administration of the two great organizations, the palace and the temple, and they were responsible for the recording and tracking of incoming and outgoing commodities. They were trained in the Adubba, and the Adubba is made up of the Sumerian words Atu, which means house, and Dub, as we saw, which meant tablet, so the house of the tablet, so the tablet house. We think maybe in the earlier period, in the late 3rd millennium, that this was a state-run organization, something that under the Orthodox administration was designed to en masse educate mid-level scribes, scribes as mid-level bureaucrats. But by the Old Babylonian period, the first quarter of the 2nd millennium, that this had turned to a more private, household-run scribal training operation. So we have houses, for example, in the cities of Nippur, or the city of Ur. Boy, that was really confusing. City of Sippar. We have evidence of residential or small-scale scribal education taking place there. But they learned particularly Sumerian and Akkadian, depending on the city. In the city of Nippur, for example, it was assumed that that the scribes would know Akkadian, and so they were heavily trained in the Sumerian language. It was sort of their pride and joy. So this is the basics of what a scribe is, what a scribe did. The languages of the scribes, as we've alluded to already, early scribes used the Sumerian language. The language is originally logographic, so some more Sumerian today. Udu means sheep, Nyish means wood, Atu is house, Lutu is man, An is sky. So a sign meant a word. And so when they wanted to write sheep, they would write Udu. As the language developed, there was a need to represent more complex words and phrases. And so what they did is they would take these very often monosyllabic signs that were used to represent these words, and they changed the use, they altered the use to represent instead syllables. So for example, ga means milk, on means sky, and do 3 means to build. However, if you look down there at the bottom, ga on do 3 does not mean milk, sky, to build. Gandu is a verbal form, and it means let me build for him. So gandu. So they're using the word, the sign that is ga, pronounced ga, and the sign that is pronounced on, and putting them to create the sound gan before do 3. And do 3, gandu, do means to build in this context when utilizing that sign. So these are being used phonetically, syllabically, rather than logographically. So there was a development in the language. This complexity led to the necessity of extensive and detailed training in the language, which was further necessitated by the incorporation of Akkadian. So when Akkadian came into common use, it had borrowed the Sumerian writing system. And because of that, Akkadian has a greater number of sounds to represent. And so these signs took additional values. So again, it's very complex. Logograms were restricted to certain common words, like God, king, silver, wood, city, and so on. And there were also signs used in other forms, like determinatives. And so again, the point here is not for you to remember all of this, but to know that it was very complex. And so scribal training was absolutely essential as the language developed. In later scholarly texts, as we talked about, logograms came into greater use. So they were, as the language developed, they were restricted to these words that we just said there, words like that, God, king, silver, and so on. However, down into the first millennium, when there was this attempt to make certain types of texts less accessible to people, they began to use more and more logograms, which were understood less or recognizable less to the majority of people. And so this made it more esoteric and difficult to understand. This intentionality in making the text more complex to make them harder to understand to those that were uninitiated. So, some basic scribal practices. There were 3 forms of clay writing media: clay tablets, small tags or bullae, which again they're small. They're used to you can hang them on strings to seal doors. You can put them on baskets to identify the tablets that are in that basket. So they're identifying marks or places to roll cylinder seal impressions for security purposes. So clay tablets, tags and bullae, and what he calls ceremonial forms. These tend to be a little more durable. So prisms, cylinders, and barrels. And we'll get into this as time goes by. The wedges were impressed with a stylus into the clay to form the cuneiform signs, again, as you see down below. A slip, as we mentioned before, was sometimes added to allow for greater precision with particularly smaller wedges. And there were several types of tablet storage, and we have archaeological evidence for these. So there were clay jars where tablets could be stored. There were baskets, as I mentioned above, that could be identified by tags. And also shelves. Shelves were used to hold these tablets. And the tablets, when stood on the shelf, ostensibly were identified on the edges in a similar fashion to us writing on bindings of books, so that we can identify them without actually pulling each of the tablets out. The direction of writing is something that I think we should at least have a cursory understanding of. So let's take a look at a tablet. This is Proc B471, which means nothing to probably anybody listening, but this was my tablet that I did for my dissertation. And the direction of writing, if this is column 1, you can see here this line dividing the column. So this is column 1, this is column 2. This is the front of the tablet, which we call the obverse. This is the back of the tablet. And column 3 would be here, and column 4 would be here. So you read the text from left to right, like this, and you read top to bottom. Then you come up to the next column and read down. However, when you want to go to the back, you don't turn it. I always mix these up. You don't turn it, I think, on its vertical axis. In other words, you flip it end over end is what you do. So if this is the top up here, you flip it top to bottom, and the top comes down here. So this is the reverse. It's flipped from top to bottom, and you begin up here on the upper right-hand side, and you read down for column 3, come back up, read down for column 4. You can see that sometimes they would incise rulings in between the lines. These are double rulings, which indicate breaks. This is a lamentational text. We can talk about it if you're interested at a later date, but this is just a basic introduction to how these tablets were read and their orientation. So at the end of a tablet, you often had a number of things. You could have curses that were placed on the tablet, talking about anybody that changes this tablet or destroys the tablet, whatever. The gods would curse them in such and such a way, and they were very formulaic. There was also a colophon, which is basically down at the end. It was often set off by a ruling, and it would give sometimes the date. It could give a whole bunch of information. The date, for example, the name of the scribe. If you had a series like 𝀭we've talked about this in other videos, a tablet series that had a number of tablets, they could label it, this is tablet 1, tablet 2, tablet 3, and so on. So that could be in the colophon at the end of the tablet. So to summarize, scribes were an integral part of the bureaucratic system in Mesopotamia. They tracked and recorded a variety of transactions. The complexities of Sumerian and Akkadian ultimately required extensive training for those that wanted to become scribes. Tablets came in many shapes and sizes, and we'll talk about these in our next daily data, which changed and developed throughout Mesopotamian history. I'm going to vary a little bit because there's been an awful lot of work done since Oppenheim wrote his book. So I'm going to kind of go off script in the next lesson, talking about scribal education, and so that you can understand a little better the information that we have on how scribes learned to read and to write. So stay with us. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back to part 23 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization by A. Leo Oppenheim. We are summarizing his book, and today we're going to be looking at what I consider to be fascinating subject of scribal education. We're going to look at descriptions from literary texts, ancient exercise tablets, and then finally painting a big picture. We're not going to go into all the details that we could go into about scribal education, but I think this will give you a good idea of the basics and how scribes, particularly in the early second millennium, learned their craft. So, we have a number of literary compositions that describe aspects of scribal training to greater or lesser degrees. One important text is School Days. It was edited originally by Kramer. Some of the phrases that are found in the text, I think, are worth noting. They paint a fun, interesting picture of scribal education, probably, as we'll talk about in a moment, in the late 3rd millennium. What did you do in school? And the student says, I read my tablet, ate my lunch, prepared my tablet, wrote it, finished it. The student goes home and says to his mother, "Wake me early in the morning. I must not be late, or my teacher will cane me." Of course, when he gets to school, these are the sorts of things that the teacher says, or the person that was in charge of him. "Why, when I was not here, did you talk?" "Caned me." "Why, when I was not here, did you go out?" "Caned me." "Your hand," or your scribal hand, your handwriting, "is not good." "Caned me." Later, the boy goes home, and the teacher actually comes and visits him at his house, and the story ends well. But it's an interesting picture from a literary perspective of scribal education. But this paints the picture of a formal school setting. It would appear something that we don't have evidence for in the early second millennium. What we have in the early second millennium, from which we get the majority of our literature, our literary tablets, both in, particularly our Sumerian literary tablets, comes from the beginning of the second millennium, the first quarter of the second millennium. And what we have there is evidence of private home scribal education. So House F at Nippur, or Utu's house up at Sippar, down in the city of Ur. But these are all residential places. These are not large scribal schools in the sense that we would think of, like a public school. And we won't go into any detail here, but just to say it has been theorized that these types of literary texts may describe scribal schooling in the earlier period, during the late third millennium, during the Ur III period, when the bureaucracy required scribes as mid-level bureaucrats, and it is entirely possible that these types of scribal schools did exist then. But this is where we originally got our information about scribal schooling, was from the literature. But in the last several decades, scholars have moved on to a more precise way of figuring out what scribal education was like and how scribes learned, by using archaeological methods. So we actually have many ancient exercise tablets. So during the early second millennium, archaeologists have discovered that there were exercise tablets that were used in many different Mesopotamian cities. I've mentioned 3 already: Sippar, Nippur, Ur, but many others. And of the tablets that were found, that were exercise tablets, they've been classified into 4 different types. Type 1, 2, 3, and 4. We are very original in Assyriology. Type 1 tablets are large, often multi-column tablets, and these are, they will often contain entire compositions. Type 2 are 2-column tablets. On the left-hand side, you see the writing of an instructor, and on the right-hand side, you see the copy that the student makes of the instructor's writing. So the instructor writes out several lines of text on the left, and the student copies it on the right. Now, if you look at those tablets, you'll see that the right-hand side is much thinner. The clay is much thinner, because each time the student would copy, he would often erase by rubbing the clay out, which made the clay thinner on the right-hand side. So you can see them practicing the instructor's model. Type 3 are 1-column tablets that contain maybe a quarter of a particular composition, a quarter of a composition that would be written ultimately on a Type 1 tablet, the large multi-column tablets. We'll talk about what they were used for in a moment. And then Type 4, these are what were called lentil-shaped, these sort of oblong, rounded tablets, which contained very basic elementary writing. And you can tell that the signs are crudely formed. Someone that's just learning how to write these signs, you have very basic writing on these Type 4 lentil-shaped tablets. Well, scholars, when archaeologists found these, Assyriologists looked at them and said, well, now that we've classified them, how do we make sense of how these things were used? And can we look at these tablets, and given the information that we see on them, given the compositions that we see being copied, can we put together a type of curriculum that was used, an order of compositions that were copied and memorized to try to give an idea of what was the sequence of scribal education like. And this is what they have come up with. Stage 1. Type 4 lentil-shaped tablets were first used to copy out simple writing exercises. And again, we mentioned that the writing was often crude or elementary level, but you see the practicing of cuneiform wedges or individual signs or syllables, these types of basic writing exercises. And so we can, it has been determined that these were, of course, written out first. This is stage 1. Stage 2 utilized the type 2 tablets. If you remember, these are the ones that have the instructor's handwriting on the left, vertical line, and then the student's copy on the right. And so the instructor would write out in a nice script on the left-hand side, and the student would try to copy it on the right, and then he would erase it and try again. On the reverse of the tablet, though, you see an exercise that had already been memorized, so that the student already knew that what was on the obverse was something new that they were learning. And so, if you understand that, then you can say what was on the reverse in the curriculum, quote unquote, came first, because they had to memorize that first. And so you can take these type 2 tablets and generate a curriculum, the order of the sequence, at least, of the exercises. This one came first, then this one came second. What was on the reverse was earlier, what was on the obverse was later. And so they were able to sequence out many of these compositions. Stage 3 was represented by type 3 tablets. Those are the single column, contain about a quarter of a longer composition, usually like a literary composition, that had been memorized. And they would write that out from memory, which would then lead to stage 4. The type 3 tablets were used to memorize a composition in quarters. Once all 4 quarters had been memorized, then a type 1 tablet was used to write out the entire composition from memory. And so you can see the stages of progression here. Basic writing with type 4 tablets, practicing slightly more advanced texts with the instructor's hand immediately available, moving on to type 3 tablets where they're producing a quarter of a composition roughly from memory, and then finally writing out the entire composition from memory. And so this was roughly the way in which scribal training took place during the Old Babylonian period. Now, there are lots of other things that we could say about scribal training, but I think this will be sufficient to give you an understanding basically of how scribal education took place. It went from simple to complex, involved an awful lot of memorization and writing out of these signs over and over again, these compositions over and over again, in order to understand both the grammar and the syntax and the use of the multivalency of all of these cuneiform signs. It's an extraordinarily difficult process. Nonetheless, it produced scribes that took a great deal of pride in their craft. So, to sum it up, while literary texts describe formal school settings, this was probably not the case during the early second millennium, the time that we get, from which we get the majority of our school tablets in the archaeological record. It very well may describe the Ur III period, the late third millennium. There were 4 different types of exercise tablets that were used in scribal education, and through stages of learning, from simple to complex, students would ultimately memorize entire literary compositions. In our next lesson, we're going to move on to the final section of Oppenheim's book. This will lead us into a very interesting section on medicinal practices and how physicians operated. Hopefully this will be very illuminating to everyone involved, so stay with us. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back, everyone, to episode 25 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. This is going to be a short video because we're talking about things that I know very little about. And those things are mathematics and astronomy. So areas in school that I wish I would have studied more. But we're going to very briefly look at setting the parameters of this study. Then we're going to look at mathematics and astronomy. So Oppenheim opens with a statement that I think is absolutely essential. And if you get nothing else out of this video, then this quote and understanding what it means and applying it to your scholarship, I will die a happy person. Throughout this book, it has been my aim not to step beyond the limits given by texts and documents which I have read myself and judged relevant for the portrait toward which I have been striving. In the case of mathematics and astronomy, I have to restrict myself to a short report based on the presentation of experts who have treated these texts firsthand and have written extensively on them. In other words, I don't have an expertise on this. I'm not going to say more than I can about it. I'm going to intentionally restrict myself and rely on people that have an expertise in these fields. Oh, that we all had such wisdom. If we would all realize that while we want to know and should strive to know as much as we can about a variety of topics, when we're going to make definitive statements, we need to examine ourselves and say, what expertise do I really have in this area? And should I be challenging the consensus view of scholars in this field? And if I am, do I really have the expertise and the training to be able to do so? So when it comes to mathematics, there are several types of sources. There are multiplication tablets. They show squares, cubes, roots. Their exponential function is used to calculate interest, which of course was a very important thing for Mesopotamian scribes. And then there are problem texts. They're generally written in the second person, so you. They provide problems with facts and figures and step-by-step solution instructions. These were part of the scribal curriculum, and the problems, there were often hundreds of them, and they increased, as you would expect in a pedagogical text. They increased in difficulty from simple to complex. So you have multiplication tablets, you have problem text. There are other smaller groups, but we won't go into them here. I know that's very unsatisfactory, and I apologize for that because there's a lot more obviously that could be said about mathematics. I just don't feel comfortable going into the details as I haven't done extensive research on it. Astronomy and mathematics are two areas of Mesopotamian studies of Assyriology that are actually very complex, and there are specialists that are in the field that go in depth into these areas. So I'm just trying to hit the highlights in the same way that Oppenheim did. Astronomy. So there are early Sumerian word lists that contain lists of star names and constellation names. And so we can glean information about their understanding of the heavens based on these word lists. We can look into prayers that were made to various deities, including Nana Suin, who is the moon god, Utu, Akkadian Shamash, who is the sun god, and then Inanna Ishtar, the Venus star. And these texts, these prayers, reference a variety of facts about these heavenly bodies, these deities. And then finally, a significant source from the first millennium for understanding astronomy is the series 𝑒𝑭_Apen, the Plough constellation. This is a 7th century text. It is a 2-tablet series, contains approximately 400 lines, and it's a simple star catalog. So it shows lunar, solar, stellar, and a variety of planetary phenomena. And so, again, there are a handful of people in the world that specialize in 𝑒𝑭_Apen. I remember when I had to read through and understand 𝀭for my comprehensive exams during my PhD. And I remember having a conversation with my advisor saying, it's really tough to wrap your head around 𝀭. And he said, yep, there are only a handful of people that do it. So it's very technical, and the language is actually terse and complex. And of course, obviously, it can be done. And maybe we'll do a separate video on mathematics and astronomy. I'll go into a little more detail, spend a little more time doing some research and putting a summary together. But following Oppenheim's lead here, this has been just a basic introduction to some of the mathematical sources that we have, the types of sources anyhow, and the very basics of what those texts contain. Oppenheim says, the interest of the Babylonian astronomer in the planets was governed by similar, more or less practical considerations. What were they? He was interested in predicting specific events, such as heliacal risings and settings and oppositions. The planets studied are Jupiter, Venus, Mercury, Mars, and Saturn. So very briefly in summation, Oppenheim presents a model that we should all follow. Stay in your lane, essentially, when it comes to making bold and definitive assertions about particular very controversial or complex subjects. Mathematical texts were often practical, involving the calculation of interest and solving word problems. Astronomy involved the study of lunar, solar, stellar, and planetary phenomena and was often focused on predicting specific events. On Friday, our final video, we're going to look at an overview of craftsmen and artists, so stay with us. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back, everyone, to Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. This is a summary of Elio Oppenheim's book, and we are in episode 24, coming close to the end. This week, we'll do 24, 25, and 26, and that'll be it. Today, we're going to be looking at medicine and physicians. So, an interesting topic, given the ideas of medicine in the ancient world. It's interesting to look at how they viewed medicine and the practice of it. So we're going to look at practical medicine compared to what would be considered quote-unquote scientific medicine, which is actually ironic, I think, and you'll see that when we get there. And then finally, the development of what I consider and Oppenheim considers unscientific science. So, practical medicine. This is the type of medicine that we would consider to be old, typical folk medicine. So using herbs, animal products, fat, blood, milk, bones, amongst other things, different types of minerals. These were things that were used practically to try to heal the individual, right? So, if you get on Google and you type in how to cure a cold, you might have a whole bunch of little remedies that people have that they suggest mixing honey with vinegar, and these are the types of folk medications that we're describing here. So they're actually geared toward a particular practical outcome, right? So if you drink honey when you have a sore throat, honey and tea, your throat feels better, and so this is a type of folk medication. So herbs were mixed with beer, vinegar, honey, etc. These medications could be swallowed. They could be introduced by suppositories or enemas, amongst other things. They could be applied as a lotion or a salve. At times, their use shows clearly that the qualities and effects of such herbs were known, and that's important. I think it's important to realize these people weren't morons, right? It's not that they were bumping around, unaware of what was going on with their physical world, right? They knew that if we did X, Y would happen. And to a certain degree, they used these herbs for that reason. Unfortunately, there was another, as we're going to see, overriding consideration in their minds, this quote-unquote, what they consider to be this more scientific approach to medicine that overrode the idea and use of practical medicine. So, continuing the quote, all too often, however, their use seems to have been dictated by reasons other than positive knowledge. So we're going to see some examples of that here, in particular with scientific medicine. So what Oppenheim is saying is that even when they applied practical medicine, it wasn't always because they knew there was going to be a particular positive outcome when the herbs were used. It was always intermixed, or often intermixed, with this underlying idea of omena, the things that were behind, the magical aspects of medicine. So let's take a look at that. So scientific medicine, the symptoms were signs. They were signs for essentially the physician diviner, or the diviner physician, that indicated the course and outcome of the disease. And they were in this way functioning just like omens, right? So if X, then Y. This allowed the physician to perform the correct countermeasures. So when a particular disease, a particular symptom showed itself, they would be able to consult the lists, consult and identify what it is that symptom portended, and then they would be able to perform the correct ritual countermeasure to overcome the effect that was coming. They would do things like examine the body. They would do so to determine the temperature of the body, how the blood vessels appeared. They would check the pulse, but these things were not done in the sense that we would consider them, right? Temperature wasn't taken to say, the temperature is elevated, therefore the body is trying to overcome the disease by raising the temperature, or the blood vessels are appear in this way, and so this is what's going on inside of the body. These were signs, right? These were parts of omena that if the temperature went to this particular thing, it indicated that this was going to happen in the disease. The pulse was not taken to say, the pulse is a little quicker, so this indicates this is going on in the body. It was another sign. It was a part of an omen that portended one thing or another. Signs indicated often whether the patient will live or die. So by the middle of the first millennium, there had been a shift away from this folk style of practice, medicinal practice, to the omen style scientific practice. So shifting away from actually using herbs to try to practically resolve diseases in a pragmatic way, to really focusing in on these omen style driven medicinal practices. Oppenheim says it is sufficient to point to the shift in attitude which brought prestige to what we consider unscientific medical speculations, these omena, right? There's this shift that takes place, and the diviner physician is given prestige. He's given the more important place in society, particularly with the royal court. And this shifts away from the practitioner that used folk-style herbal treatments. And this is done, he says, to the detriment of a sober, although hardly very efficient, folk-type medicine based on whatever positive knowledge of plants and of the human body the experienced practitioner had been able to assemble and digest. In other words, they were the practical physician was on the way to determining in more and more sophisticated ways how medicinal substances interacted with the body to bring about positive results. And that progress was held in check by this unscientific science. This was something that interrupted the progress of practical medicine in ancient Mesopotamia. So, in summation, there were two types of physicians, practical and scientific. Practical doctors used herbs and other folk-style practices, while scientific physicians were essentially diviners, reading symptoms as signs. In the later period, scientific practices overshadowed practical medicine, which interrupted the development of medicinal practices in ancient Mesopotamia. On Wednesday, we're going to take a look at mathematics and astronomy. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Welcome back to the final video in the summary of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. This is episode 26, and we are looking at crafting materials and general practice, sort of a large overview of the use of domesticated plants and animals, and some metallurgy and building constructions. So it's a fitting end to our series by 𝑎 Oppenheim on Ancient Mesopotamia and Introduction. So we're going to look at gardens versus fields, domesticated plants and animals, tanning and weaving, just very general things about them, metallurgy, and then finally some of the building practices that are found in Mesopotamia. So gardens. Gardens were the earliest form of plant care and growing. They were obviously smaller when compared to fields, and the plants that were grown in the gardens were those that required constant care, which makes sense. Of course, yields were smaller, and but these plants could be prepared, generally speaking, quickly. It didn't require extensive work to either cultivate or to harvest. Fields, on the other hand, were larger. They produced significant yields, and they did not require constant care, but seasonally there was an intensive amount of work that required a great deal of manpower, but again produced significant yields that could be stored. And these, both gardens and fields, were used in Mesopotamia to varying degrees in various places. Some of the primary domesticated plants and animals are discussed by Oppenheim. One is the date palm. One of the issues that you find in Mesopotamia, particularly in the south, is that the water that is used is often brackish. So the plants that grow, those that are more resistant, have a greater tolerance for brackish or salty water, obviously do better. So the primary fruit of the region is the date palm. It has a high tolerance to brackish water. It required little maintenance, and it had a great number of uses given the byproducts of the plant. And so it could be used to craft a number of different items. Barley was a staple product. Again, it had a high tolerance to brackish water. The seeding and the plowing process was eventually mechanized by the use of the cedar plow. This was a great invention in the area and allowed for much longer fields to be plowed and seeded, given that the plow did not have to be turned as often on a long field. It could be pulled by cattle. There was a tube that was used to drop the seeds in as the plowing process went, so it was much faster, much more efficient, and of course required a great deal of manpower to plant and to harvest, but the yields became much greater. The domesticated animals that required no special care in the region were those like the dog, the donkey, the duck and the goose, and the pig. Of course, those animals that required special care, particularly for their products, were goats, sheep, and dairy cattle. Two particular crafts that he discusses at length are tanning and weaving. Essentially, neither technology appears to have fully developed in Mesopotamia when you compare it to the West. So, for example, in tanning, the Mesopotamian process used far more oils and fats than were necessary, and so the development was not as sophisticated as was found in the West. Oppenheim discusses metallurgy and notes that it is difficult to generate enough heat in Mesopotamia during this period to reach the temperatures necessary to practice metallurgy effectively. In addition, when trying to gather evidence for metallurgical practices in the region, it's difficult given that our sources, our physical evidence, is relatively scarce, given that these materials were often reused by those that came after. So he talks a little bit about iron. Iron ore can be reduced at a lower temperature than copper. However, casting iron requires a higher temperature, often than was able to be generated. But it was still utilized because iron can be hammered out while it's hot, just at a lower temperature. He finishes up the chapter by discussing some of the building practices, particularly using mud. So walls were originally constructed in a Pise style, so this sort of rammed earth, layering. Later, mud bricks were formed in frames and dried, but mortar was not generally used between the bricks. Instead, they smeared mud, spread it along the sides of the wall. Unfortunately, by doing this, it restricts the height and the stability of the wall. In summation, many of the materials that were used in daily life for sustenance and crafting came from domesticated plants and animals. The arts of tanning and weaving, while used and developed in Mesopotamia, did not gain the level of advancement as was found in the West. Metallurgy was practiced, but did not reach advanced levels, as with tanning and weaving. And then finally, eventually, mud brick became the primary means of construction in Mesopotamia. So that's it. In our next Daily Data series, we will be looking at sex and eroticism in Mesopotamia. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?